Chapter 2074. Published at 11th of August 2023 11:02 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 2074. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The willowy shadow paused. It was clear that this was the very last thing that she had expected to hear. What would the cloud race be doing here? And worst yet, why would they be interfering in their plans? She suddenly thought of the worst possibility and she couldn't help but tremble a bit. I don't think that the situation is that bad, Zavnik said. These cloud race members come from the Prince of Earth. The shadow jumped again, before she seemed to piece together the same things that Zavnik had slowly come to understand while he listened to Lionel's words. But what baffled the shadow was why Zavnik would know this. It couldn't be. He just directly told me. That littlest cousin of mine is not simple. He knows well that him informing me that he has cloud race members under his charge doesn't lessen my worries. In fact, it increases them. Look at him, he didn't even have to lift a finger and yet I've directly executed 10,000 of my men for him. He has such a charming smile and glistening eyes, and yet his heart is no less cruel than anyone I've ever met. The shadow paused for a moment before giggling. Keep talking like that and he'll start getting jealous. Don't tell me you'll fall for your own cousin when you have me? Zavnik seemed to be very used to this shadow and her antics, but at the same time he wasn't in the mood to play around. His thoughts were running 1,000,000 miles a minute. Even as he spoke, he was trying to figure out what to do from here. Sensing this as well, the shadow's voice changed, and she became more serious. Tell me exactly what happened. Zavnik almost carelessly explained things in the most direct way possible. His contact with Lionel was brief to begin with, so there wasn't much to explain. I see. Indeed, this littlest Nova isn't a simple character. Not only did he tell you so much, he didn't even ask you to reciprocate. It's as though he couldn't be bothered to care. Or he knows everything he needs to know already, Zavnik said lightly. The shadow fell silent. Indeed, if cloud race members had already infiltrated, what could there be that Lionel didn't know? In fact, it would be an exaggeration to say that Lionel might know even more than Zavnik himself did. How could a leader know every little thing his subordinates did? There might very well be some who were dissatisfied with his orders, some holding grudges from the death of their loved ones, and these would all be things that Lionel would have access to that others wouldn't dare to tell him for the sake of retribution. Just by being honest, Lionel had actually painted Zavnik into a corner he didn't know how to advance from and couldn't retreat from. Is there a chance he's lying just to mess with you? Unlikely. Given his displays in the past, and the precarious situation of Earth, the odds that he really has cloud race members are quite high. The real question is how powerful they are. Then how do you plan on moving forward? This isn't something that we can allow to go freely. If we're too lax, victory will slip from us. What do you suggest? I think you should take a look at the shadow. Laughed a seductive laugh. If it was up to me, we would take the most direct approach. As I see it, he's managed to reach this stage likely using his mind over his brawn. There are potentially powerful cloud race members protecting him, but if you take an elite squadron with you, I don't believe you would lose. In addition, you did well giving him that air-grade reward. He'll never be ready for the poison now, and he might even foolishly try to use it on you, leaving him in a precarious position. Zavnik thought for a moment, then shook his head. The eyes of Lionel weren't those of someone who was simple to handle. He wouldn't be handled with brute force directly, at least not without revealing his true face. But he wouldn't do that unless it was the final hope he had. The shadow laughed, unbothered. You never listen to me anyway, but you always ask. This is just you trying to make me feel like I'm more than just a bed buddy, huh? I'm wise to your games. Zavnik didn't move for an entire hour, nor did he respond to the shadow's attempts at seducing him. Then, when there were just 2 hours left to his and Lionel's meeting, his gaze suddenly glowed with a fiercely bright light. Oh, my hubby has a plan? Tell me. I'm certain of Lionel's final trump card. The pious family. No one would ever guess that a constellation family would divert their resources at the final moment, and especially not to the one young man so many of them want to kill. It seems that Lionel's charm is even greater than that of Daoist's. The pious family's position was a bit unique. They had a portion of 6th Nova's old territory, and it had to be remembered that 6th Nova was once sandwiched between the Omen and Spirituals' religion. If Zavnik attacked the Spirituals' religion normally, and then tried to retreat back to his territory after all was said and done, who would be waiting for him right as he was in his most vulnerable position? The worst part was that after passing through the pious, there would still be the Omen lingering, and with just a bit of prodding from Lionel, they might jump to capitalize on the situation well. Of course, this wasn't what Zavnik had spent an entire hour figuring out. "I know what we'll do," he said lightly, standing to his feet. As though on cue, Ismson came rushing in from the outside. "Prepare the troops, Ismson. We are moving out now." Zavnik strode forward, his gait confident. Chapter 2075. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:33 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 2075. I'm sorry if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel sat atop of a lion beast from the Leo family. Their size wasn't all that substantial, especially not compared to what he had seen in the Cataclysm Zone, but it was still more than substantial enough for 3 or even 4 people to be seated upon it, and definitely large enough for him to be able to take Aina with him so that he wouldn't be bored on the journey. Aina could only be speechless. The Lionel of the last few months and this Lionel were far too different. She couldn't even count the number of times Lionel had smiled in the last few months because it had basically never happened. Now he was in the mood to tease her all the time. It made it all the more embarrassing that she knew that his parents were likely watching, and probably even her father. The projections went all across the human domain, so even if they weren't physically present, it would only take a little effort to watch. Knowing this, she felt a bit embarrassed about what had happened before. She had actually kissed him in front of so many people, and now he wouldn't leave her alone. Aina suddenly pinched Lionel's thigh fiercely, causing him to yelp. This time, Lionel didn't have to fake it. This woman truly had a strong enough grip. This time, it was Lionel's turn to be speechless. What had he done this time? He couldn't even tease his wife? Where was the humanity? In the end, he could only pout. Be obedient. Be serious. Look at them, how can you lead people like this? The various soldiers were doing their best to hold back their laughter. Did they look down on the current Lionel? Of course not. The Sky's family only knew the smiling Lionel to begin with. He had crushed their family's patriarch while hardly lifting a finger. As for the Oryx, they knew Lionel from before he even had the conviction to become king in the first place. All that Lionel knew how to do was goof around. After so many tense weeks, watching this scene made a weight on their chests lower. Because Lionel was always so perfect, everyone around him had the pressure to be perfect as well. Since Lionel never made mistakes, they couldn't make mistakes. Since even their leader was always working so hard, how could they be the ones to slack off? Lionel had never been cruel, and his demands had never been excessive, but that only made the burden the rest of them carried even heavier. No one wanted to be the one who disappointed Lionel. Even though they still had such feelings now, for some reason it didn't feel as burdensome. The relaxed Lionel gave off the illusion that everything would be fine. Even if they made 1 or 2 mistakes here and there, he would be there to cover for them. Even while marching into enemy territory like this, he was still in the mood to have fun. The respect they had for Aina was no less deep. While others had only just learned of Aina's skills, that was only because they had only just begun paying attention. All of them had already been beneficiaries of Aina's skill, and they were quite aware of battle plans that Lionel had in place that no one in the outside world was yet privy to, so they were all well aware of how much of it was contingent on Aina. So, seeing her reprimand Lionel like this, they felt like laughing in their hearts. Neither of them was inferior to the other, this was how things should be. The Oryx had grown used to following the Oryx King, and the Sky's family had obviously grown used to their own form of governance. But after just a few months with Lionel, they couldn't help but think that it would be so bad to follow such a king and queen. I think you should take a look at smiles bloomed on their faces as they watched Lionel apologize like a wronged child. The ground rumbled, an army moving forward like a swiftly shifting tide. They were akin to a sea of dark green, crushing the greenery in their path as though they couldn't be bothered to march around it. In the territory of the pious family, they had on solemn expressions. They knew that this moment would be coming soon, but they hadn't expected that the sea of people would be this great. They had already known that Zavnik had the largest armies, but it was only now that they were seeing it themselves that they knew how truly exaggerated it was. Zavnik's army, or at the very least the one marching toward them, was easily numbering at 100 million. This sort of monstrous number was enough to build its own air grade upgrade challenge, but now it was coming toward their city. If they had the strength to challenge the air grade, they would have done it already. Within the core of the city, Simona's brows furrowed. This wasn't a part of the plan. According to her original thoughts, the fact they had survived to this point likely meant that they would make it to the end point. Given their special characteristics and ability to use poison, not to mention their numbers, anyone targeting them would be sure to suffer greatly. No one in the end game would be willing to take them on until the very final moment, or so she had thought. But now, Zavnik's armies were rushing toward her, and clearly willing to go all out. Simona sighed and came to an understanding. Zavnik definitely wanted to attack the Suyard and Spiritual Religion Alliance, but was afraid of their taking advantage of the situation. So, he wanted to take them out first regardless of the cost. At the very least, even if things went poorly, he still had a lane of retreat back to his own territory. Simona's expression became a bit bitter. They had made it so far just to make a mistake at this step. "I'm sorry, Lionel, looks like things won't work out." Indeed. It seemed that Zavnik's conjecture had been correct. Chapter 2076. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:33 and 16 seconds p.m. Chapter 2076. Returned. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Simona took a breath and stood to her feet. She had indeed promised to side with Lionel. Very few would understand why she would do such a thing, or more importantly, why it was that her family seemed to be all right with it. Simona was the most talented junior born to the pious family in an extremely long time. But what many didn't know was that her status in her paternal clan was even more important. This was an extremely odd matter, and also one that very few knew about. That was because it was far too unconventional, and her Godlen family, her father's family, was far too reclusive. They tended toward nature, so aside from worshipping their god and raising their beasts, they didn't interfere with any matters, much less the politics of the human world. If not to avoid the spotlight being placed on them, Simona would have never been sent to the Void Palace in the first place. This might sound odd. After all, if you wanted to avoid detection, why do the opposite of that by sending such a genius to be placed upon the Queen Beauty rankings? However, it was precisely because of this clever maneuvering of public opinion that the Godlen family was able to keep themselves separate from worldly affairs by not allowing others to talk to them. The fact that the matriarch of the pious family had married the nameless man of an unknown family would have been shocking news enough. However, if the child between them was also under the rules and regulations of his nameless family as well, this would go from a cute love story where the underdog gained victory, to something many speculated about. The weight of marriage alliances was quite heavy. This was seen by the fact that even the likes of Amory and the Spiritual Religion heiress could be married off for the sake of their families. The idea of Simona's mother marrying a man without a hint of reputation was entirely unheard of. It had to be known that as someone that could become the matriarch of a constellation family, Matriarch Pius was no normal woman. She too had once been on the Queen Beauty rankings, and outside of Cynthia, there was rarely anyone else of her generation that could match up to her. Due to all of this, after Simona was born, in order to avoid the speculation of the public, her outward face was that of a genius of the pious family, with her father's family being of secondary concern. In fact, even her last name wasn't Godlen, but rather Pious. It painted the image that Simona's mother had managed to pick her love, but in order to compromise with her family, her daughter's future, along with any other children she might have, were under the control of the Pious family. But the reality was very far from this. In fact, it might be more accurate to say that the Pious family was quite subordinate to the Godlen family, and her parents had not a single ounce of strain between the two of them. When she visited the Godlen family, she was even referred to as Mistress Godlen. There was definitely no fear on the Godlen family's part about offending the pious family. I think you should take a look at so why was all of this important? It all went back to Simona's little purple puppy. As a member of the Godlen and pious family, she was actually born with 2 lineage factors, not 1. This was exceptionally rare, as one understood. The Morales family had billions of novas in this generation, but only 7 had been born with 2 lineage factors. The Seard family was likewise in this situation, but there were only 4 in their current generation, and one of them was Amory. However, this wasn't the important part. What was important wasn't Simona's raw talent, but rather what kind of talent it was. The Godlen's lineage factor was known as the natural beast lineage factor. When a woman gave birth to a seed of the Godlen family, she would actually give birth to 2 things. The first was their child, and the second was known as the natural beast core, an existence that looked very much like an egg. Setting aside the oddity of a human woman birthing an egg, this egg could be considered to be the most important existence to the life of a Godlen family child. That was because one's talent was split between themselves and this creature was also the outlet through which all of the Godlen's family strength was produced. One could see through the talent of a child easily by testing this egg. However, for Simona, this hadn't even been necessary. That was because the instant she and her beast companion were born, the phenomena that was triggered was the likes of which the Godlen family had never seen. And if the Godlen family had been aware, the only phenomena that could have possibly matched up was Lionel's own and the birth of his Scarlet Star Force innate node. That was the level Simona was at. Unfortunately, the more talented you were as a Godlen family member, the more time it took for your beast companion to grow. And, while your beast companion had yet to mature, not only could you not use the Godlen's family strength, but your improvement speed was only a fraction of what it could be because more than 90% would be diverted to your companion. The moment she was born, Simona was already slated to be the next leader of the Godlen family. In fact, she matched up with the prophecy of their ancient teachings. With her appearance, the Godlen family would finally be allowed to come out of seclusion, establishing their might and saving the human domain from their calamity. However, due to the schemes of Zavnik and Rosen, Simona had been separated from her beast companion during the teleportation to the Rapak's nest. This had cut off all her potential and crumbled the hope of the Godlen family. Until Lionel suddenly returned it. Chapter 2077. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:33 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 2077. Small world. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. When Simona lost her puppy, it was akin to her losing almost 90% of her talent and cutting off the future hope of the Godlen family. No matter how great their conviction, how could a population of people be willing to stay in seclusion forever? At the same time, how could Simona be willing to never reach her full potential? There was simply no replacement for her beast companion. It had quite literally been born with her. It was like an extension of her limb. This is why she had shed tears when Lionel returned it. After 20 years of despair, hearing the praises of people while knowing that she could be so much better, she finally saw the light of hope that she had prayed for so long. What she was even more thankful for was Lionel's restraint. That puppy wasn't just a benign little creature, it was also an endless bundle of energy. It had carried over 90% of her energy until this moment. Every time she took one step forward, it would take almost 10. On top of this, it was the purest form of absorbable force as well. There was a reason that the Godlen family had been forced into seclusion long ago, a story that had been wiped from the annals of human domain history. Their beast companions were just extensions of their lineage factors and were more valuable than even pure force crystals. Their beast companions could quite literally be used as resource wells. To put this matter into proper perspective, the immature beast companion of back then, the very one Simona had lost, could be used to produce dozens of conventional path 7th-dimensional existences. It could even be used at a crucial point to push one to the 8th dimension of the conventional path, something that was extraordinarily rare. She didn't believe that Lionel could sense this, but she also wasn't surprised. Lionel was a man who had turned down the Shadow Sovereign lineage factor because he could stand to kill an unborn Rapax. Many would see such Rapax as nothing more than enemies of another race, unable to humanize them in any way because they simply looked too foreign. But not him. Simona didn't know Lionel very intimately, but she knew enough about him to be willing to follow him wholeheartedly. It was just a shame that at the final moment, she wasn't able to be as useful as she had initially hoped to be. Growling, a little puppy growled by Simona's feet, causing her furrowed brows to unwrinkle into the hint of a smile. By now, the little puppy had finally begun to show some signs of growth and was about 20% larger than Lionel remembered. Although she had lost 20 years, because she was so much more powerful now, Simona could help the little one to grow a lot faster. Before, it had taken over 20 years for it to reach the stage of being able to walk around on its own. But now, after only just a year or so of having returned to her size, it had grown by 20%. At this pace, it would reach maturity in just another decade or so. Given the fact the more talented she was, the more time it would take, this speed was actually exceptional. Originally, her companion wouldn't have reached maturity until she became an ancestor-level character, and even then it wasn't entirely certain. It seemed that being forced to find a path without this little guy for so long had definitely helped her in many ways. Come on, little guy. Although we aren't allowed to display too much of our strength, I don't believe that we can't make a dent in this army. The little puppy barked with a menacing glare in its eyes, but Simona only laughed more heartily. The little guy didn't sound very menacing at all. I think you should take a look at those who knew Simona would truly be shocked right now. How could they have ever seen this ice beauty laugh like this? Simona turned and strolled forward. The more she walked, the more her laughing expression faded. By the time she walked out from the hall, her expression was icy, her purple hair dancing in the wind. Young Mississippi, a powerful voice came from the side. A young man standing atop a black line with flickering black flames for a mane appeared. The beast seemed to be both illusory and corporeal. Despite the fact the rumbling of the ground had already reached this point and the buildings were quaking, whether it was the beast or the young man, both were entirely indifferent. With the current state of things, we will lose, the young man said indifferently. They were limited in the strength they were allowed to display. In this regard, they were a lot like the Umbra family. So, the moment they saw the state of this, they knew there was nothing they could do. The question was whether or not Simona wanted them to continue to fight to put up a FAA section Ade, or to retreat right this moment. We will fight, Simona said lightly. The young man didn't show any dissatisfaction or pleasure, he only nodded once. Yes, young Mississippi. The rumbling came to a stop just half a kilometer from the gates of the pious family territory. Seated in the middle of the army, Zavnik watched on with silence as Ismson took a step forward. We will give you all a choice out of respect for the pious family. Heiress Simona may choose to crush her badge now and we will make no attempts to stop her. If you refuse, we will attack with full force. Ismson had hardly finished when the thunderous roar of countless beasts echoed. Simona's gaze flickered as another army came into view from the distance. Seated in the middle of his army, Zavnik's gaze couldn't help but narrow. It couldn't be. At that moment, Lionel rode over from the distance with his arms still wrapped around Aina's waist. He didn't seem to be taking this very seriously at all. Ah, Third Nova, Lionel said with surprise. I didn't expect that you and I would actually have the same idea. What a small world. Chapter 2078. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:33 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 2078, or if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The army was small. Compared to Zavnik's numbers in the upwards of 9 figures, the barely few 100,000 that Lionel had come with was truly too pitiful, especially when among that number, most were just wild beasts and only about 20,000 or so were actual humanoids. It didn't make sense to take this matter so seriously. And yet, Zavnik's pause was long and his thoughts came slow. He seemed to lag, not knowing exactly what to make of this immediately. When Lionel said that he had had the same idea, could it be that he wanted to deal with the pious family before he went forward to attack the Suyard and Spiritual Religion Alliance? Technically, Lionel was just as vulnerable from the back as Zavnik was given the relative positions of everything, so could it be that his deduction was wrong? In addition, Zavnik had, indeed, suddenly come up with many allies that others couldn't have expected. He had the largest numbers precisely because of this. So Lionel believing that he might have the pious family in his back pocket wasn't an impossible leap to make. As for Zavnik himself, the reason he had concluded that Lionel must have the pious family by his side was because of those matters that happened over a year ago. Back then, Lionel hadn't done much to hide the fact that he returned Simona's beast companion. In addition, Simona had very publicly stated that her paternal family would be willing to help Lionel out. Back then, it was still a taboo for the Constellation families to take part in the air wars, so it wasn't a matter that many thought about, especially since the Godlen family was relatively unknown. However, given his unique standing, Zavnik was able to put together many oddities about the Godlen family that made him pay a little bit more attention to them. Unfortunately for him, there wasn't anything that he could find in the end that was worth paying any more attention to, so he had forgotten about this matter, until he thought through the methods by which Lionel could have used to deal with him. But now seeing Lionel here, he really had no idea whether he was here to help or attack him. This sort of confusion left Zavnik feeling as though he had just short-circuited. It was too difficult to draw a conclusion, and right now, depending on how he reacted, he could make things either easier or more difficult on Lionel, and yet, at the same time, no matter what path he took, no step was perfect for him. On the one hand, there was potentially offending an ally who was more than willing to work with him ahead of a timeline that he was comfortable with. On the other hand, there was Lionel and the pious family teaming up with one another to deal with him, and he had actually delivered himself on a silver platter. Looking at Lionel's smiling face, he actually couldn't tell which one it was, and it was actually beginning to agitate him. He had always had everything in the palm of his hands. He was easily forgotten as the third Nova. It could even be called middle child syndrome if he wanted to be dramatic about it, but this had also allowed him to fly under the radar while setting up everything exactly like he wanted it. He had even played with the governing structure of the Void Palace as a mere sixth-dimensional existence, but right now he actually didn't know what to do. Lionel's expression gave nothing away, and the few seconds that were ticking by truly felt like an eternity. The more he tried to find an answer, the further it slipped away from him. It felt like everyone was observing him, waiting to see how he would react. Zavnik's confusion was just the same as everyone else. This was the largest conflict currently taking place in the air wars, so the number paying attention to this location was over 90%. But they couldn't make heads or tails of it either. Suddenly, Zavnik began to laugh. He shook his head. "I think you should take a look at, indeed, it's a funny matter," Zavnik responded to Lionel's words finally. "As they say, great minds think alike. But I'm beginning to feel that your mind and mine aren't exactly the same at all. It seems that we've been quite on guard against one another, so what will you do, Lionel?" Lionel grinned. "Well, that depends. If I help you out, will you kill me like you did your subordinates once you're finished with me?" Zavnik's smile didn't fade, but the downcast over his gaze only grew. "I'm not sure what you mean, littlest Nova." "You don't?" "Ah, you really might not, but that's because I forgot to explain something during our first meeting. What you might not know is that the reason no one else can build territories in the ocean is because all four seas have already been claimed." Zavnik's pupils constricted, but his expression wasn't too surprising. After all, he knew this already. Everyone was dealing with the very same situation and they were all wary of one another, wondering which four powers had actually managed such a thing. The problem was that there weren't many powers remaining, there were barely over 4 in number to begin with. So who could have done it? "The simplest answer is usually the right one," Lionel said with a chuckle. "But even when you have that saying in mind, the importance of context is also important. There are only 6 powers remaining. Myself, yourself, the Omen family, the Pious family, the Seared family and the Spirituals religion. However, 2 of those powers are in an alliance, and so there's only 5 powers remaining, technically. And you yourself are certain that you don't own a sea, so that means what, exactly?" Zavnik suddenly shuddered. It was either all 4 powers remaining aside from himself had claimed a sea, or Lionel grinned. They were all claimed by a single person. "You tell me, which is the simplest answer?" Chapter 2079. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:33 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 2079. Refute? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Zavnik felt as though his mind was collapsing. Looking at Lionel's charming smile, his heart was threatening to beat out of his chest. It was, indeed, the simplest answer. It was just one that he wasn't willing to accept. He had the largest number of people, and he had even been the closest to claiming a C aside from Lionel before Orinik and the others had been booted out by Lionel's success. What made more sense? That everyone but the one with the largest number of followers had managed to succeed in such a difficult endeavor, or that just one person with a perfect system had managed to do the impossible and claim the entire ocean for him? When it was laid out like this, the answer was all too obvious, and it wasn't even one that Zavnik could refute. It was then that the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. How had they managed to make it to this point in the conversation? Wasn't it because Lionel was accusing him of killing his subordinates? Of course, he had done so, but how could Lionel have any proof of that? But then he remembered, he had sent Isomson to the ocean. Back then, it had just been the obvious choice. The continent had already been cleared of its resources by the rapaciousness of the heirs. The only resources that remained were within the ocean. If he wanted to send a team out on a pretense, the only location he could use was the ocean. But the entire ocean was Lionel's territory. Everything that happened within it, every person who stepped foot within its borders, especially if it was a number as large as within the thousands, would be known by him. Zavnik wanted to speak, but Lionel had already flipped a palm, throwing an orb into the air. At that moment, the images began to speed by one after another. Basically no one had paid attention to Zavnik sending out his subordinates on a mission to clear dungeons. The fascination with dungeons had long since waned, and the public was far more excited about the coming alliance war between the Morales and the Suyard. Zavnik knew this and had taken advantage of the situation. Although he had spoken Isomson's orders aloud, the reality was that only Isomson himself and the shadow beneath his feet had heard it. He had long since come up with a system to hide his actions perfectly, but it seemed that none of this mattered at the moment. He couldn't even stop Lionel. He could only watch as the actions of Isomson were broadcasted. The slaughter of his subordinates was right before everyone, and no small number of individuals felt their hearts grow cold. Others might not know, but those within Zavnik's army knew all too well. Isomson was Zavnik's right-hand man. Many of the orders they received came from him directly. Even those that weren't familiar with Zavnik's chain of command had watched enough battles to know this. And those that were a little too foolish to pick up on this earlier had quite literally just seen Isomson step forward to give Simona an ultimatum. It was like every step Zavnik took just chained him down further, suffocating him until the point his vision could only go black. He was certain that Lionel had even waited to appear until after Isomson had spoken just so that the connection could be made even easier. He didn't even pause the video, he didn't speed it up. He forced them all to watch as Isomson trapped and killed over 10,000 of Zavnik's subordinates, one after another without pause. Maybe the most eerie part was that Lionel's smile never faded even a single time. His arm remained wrapped around Aina's waist, enjoying her supple skin as though he was still on vacation, rather right in the middle of a battlefield. I think you should take a look at. Suddenly, the video came to an end and silence fell. Oh, it's over, Lionel said lightly, putting the orb away. Zavnik sat in silence. His expression had long since become placid, but a brewing rage was within his heart despite not showing up in the slightest. You put on a nice show for us all, Zavnik said softly. Lionel smiled. I try my best. When you told me that you had so many Cloud Race members on your side, I didn't believe you. But you're quite bold to be willing to kill thousands of them. They would have been very helpful toward your cause. Lionel's smile didn't fade, although he very much understood what Zavnik was trying to say. Clearly he wanted to pretend as though this was all a ruse. Either that or he wanted everyone to believe that everyone he had ordered Isomson to kill had been a member of the Cloud Race. Me? Controlling the Cloud Race? Where? Lionel blinked innocently. Your imagination is pretty wild, Third Nova. Zavnik clenched his jaw so hard that his teeth almost cracked, a vein surging up his throat and another pulsing across his forehead. Slowly, he calmed down. Of course, everyone watching in the human domain knew that Lionel had Cloud race members, but Zavnik's people didn't know that. In addition, those watching knew that Lionel only had a few hundred Cloud race members. Where would he get over 10,000 from? His greatest weakness was his small numbers. Lionel was simply too brilliant. Convincing people only required the simplest explanations. Everyone outside knew he had Cloud race members and could draw the conclusion that he had too few of them, but if he tried to explain this to Zavnik's subordinates, it would take too many words and many wouldn't believe him over Zavnik. So, he chose the simplest approach, making Zavnik's explanation look as ridiculous as possible. There was simply nothing Zavnik could say to refute. Like this, he killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Everyone in the human domain now knew exactly how vicious Zavnik was, while his subordinates did as well. Would they be able to continue fighting for him? Chapter 2080. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:33 and 9 seconds p.m. Chapter 2080. Flatten if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. If Lionel's greatest weakness was his small numbers, then Zavnik's greatest weakness was that he simply had too many subordinates. There were too many factions, too many families, too many powers. Each one had their own thoughts, and though they had come together, this was under the assumption that Zavnik was their best choice and the best leader they had. If they were suddenly given reason to not agree with this, then what would they do? Lionel had obviously thought of the possibility that these subordinates were procured for Zavnik by the Three-Finger Cult or the Demon Race, but would they all be? How could such a top-tier secret be kept by so many people? Lionel believed that it was likely the only people who were aware of this information amongst Zavnik's subordinates were those in the highest echelons. The likelihood that those so high up in their families would be participating in this air war was next to zero. It had to be remembered that the age limit was 100 years old. It would be very rare for someone of that status to be trusted with such information. Even if Lionel took a step back and believed that such people were within these walls and participating in this matter, how many of this 100 million number would there be? Maybe 1 for every million? Less than that? Would they even be able to control the situation if a rebellion occurred? Of those that had died, there were brothers, there were sisters, there were parents, there were friends. Lionel really wanted to see what Zavnik would do now. He probably hadn't even informed them just yet that so many had recently died. While death was an inevitable part of the air wars, this sort of death wasn't the kind that those below would be able to accept. It only made the situation worse that heirs usually had a way out, while subordinates could only accept their fate, dying when they came across something they couldn't defeat. As expected, Lionel's words had hardly fallen when the discomfort within Zavnik's army began to spread. Lionel had hardly done anything. He had simply spoken a few words and Zavnik fell head first into his trap, thinking himself to be bold and clever. Even now, he continued to smile, not in a single hurry to attack at all. Soon, the disorder in the army continued, reaching a pinnacle and certain sections began to peel off, looking towards Zavnik with unfriendly gazes. Despite the animosity they felt, they didn't dare to attack Zavnik directly. They were just members of small families, how could they lay hands on a moralist heir? At the same time, Zavnik's survival was their only way out of this place without losing their lives. If they had had an easy method of snatching his badge, they would have done it. On the city walls, Simona's gaze flickered. She looked down toward Lionel with an unreadable expression. Her deepest interaction with Lionel had been in Rapak's nest. He defeated Amory with 3 arrows, defeated those variant invalids with ease, and had even carved out a path for them to escape utilizing nothing but the materials around him. He had always been unfathomable to her, but this was the first time she was truly seeing it. The Lionel she had met back then was trying to be someone he wasn't, pulling himself toward being more serious and professional. He seemed to have completed his transformation in their most recent interaction. But now, he somehow felt far more natural, far more like himself, as though a burden he had been carrying had suddenly vanished. If she knew what Lionel had gone through recently, she would have truly been rendered speechless. How could learning of such a thing relieve his burdens? Especially given how he had reacted to the news initially. Zavnik watched as his subordinates backed away from him. He didn't say even a single word, he didn't try to plead for them to stop, in fact he hadn't even looked at them directly just yet, his eyes entirely focused on Lionel from start to finish. He had, indeed, had a great plan. He was going to swiftly crush the pious family and then retreat under the pretext of having been ambushed. Of course, Lionel would know that this was nonsense because he was allied with the pious family to begin with, but he wasn't important, it was instead the remaining enemies. While Lionel was distracting the Suyard family, and he was retreating, the Omen family might try to take advantage of the situation. Like this, Lionel would likely be assaulted by the Suyard alliance, and he would be able to catch the Omen family suddenly off guard and deal them a decisive blow. Like this, he would have played all of his enemies in his palm and he would come out on top. But now, it all seemed so silly and worthless. Zavnik finally calmed down and chuckled. He hadn't been this enraged maybe ever. He had truly been played by this littlest cousin of his. Soon, much of Zavnik's army had peeled away. When they made it into the distance without Zavnik reacting, they began to move faster, forming a large and larger gap. Soon, many were even over a kilometer away, but even then, Zavnik didn't do anything. However, not everyone left. In fact, over 10 million remained. Even so, a loss over almost 90% without a single battle was a truly shocking matter. Lionel's smile deepened. To him, this was just a little game. In the overall scheme, those 90 million Zavnik had just lost were nothing more than cannon fodder. These 10 million remaining, each one with stone faces and gazes that didn't seem to perceive anything around them at all. These 10 million were the true danger. You've really succeeded in pissing me off, littlest Nova, Zavnik said lightly, his smile returning. Let's decide which of us will be the final Morales right here and now. Oh. That's unfortunate, Lionel pouted. I thought we were really hitting it off, what happened to our alliance? Aina and Simona bit their lips, seemingly trying to hold back their laughter. This Lionel was truly too good at pissing people off. Isemson slowly unsheathed a saber, his expression as dark as night. Zavnik didn't answer Lionel directly, instead waving a hand and pointing. Flatten the city. Chapter 2081. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:33 and 7 seconds p.m. Chapter 2081. Bulldoze if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's smile didn't fade as he finally released Aina's waist. He slipped off the back of the lion beast and his figure flickered. With a speed that was difficult to spot, he appeared atop the walls. He wore a calm expression as the 10 million troops below rumbled into motion. His actions didn't seem to make much sense. Down below, his own army, which was only a fraction of the size, was in a precarious situation and there very clearly wasn't any time to open the city gates without also risking the entry of Zavnik's army as well. It looked as though Lionel's people would be crushed first, before Simona's people followed soon afterward. This was clear to everyone, except for Lionel himself, apparently. Just then the lion beasts roared, leaping forward. Their numbers were large, numbered upward of 200,000. However, compared to a sea of 10 million, it really seemed as though it would be worth much. Until, suddenly, collars around their neck began to glow one after another. Their manes flourished and grew a striking shade of gold, until that light suddenly peeled away, forming a circular disk of golden light. This circular disk moved before the heads of the charging lion beasts, snapping into place as they connected with one another one by one. Suddenly, the charging sea of lion beasts formed a golden shield that spanned hundreds of meters, blocking the path forward for the army of 10 million rushing for them. Lionel hadn't used the lion beasts until now, but that wasn't because he had forgotten about them. They were simply not very useful in the ocean waters. Although it wasn't like they were helpless in the water, the trade-off wasn't worth it, especially if that meant that he had to reveal another trump card. This time, though, was a perfect situation for them. The collars they were wearing currently were mass-produced crafts created under the efforts of the segmented cube. It was one size fits all and each one was of the life grade. Their only purpose was to convert the large well of the seventh dimensional force these pitiful beasts were in control over into a formation of powerful defenses. Back when Lionel had formed the armors for the stingrays, he had thought of using this method, but he had decided against it in the end because he wanted something more powerful, and that would require taking into account the unique measurements of each individual stingray. Now, however, he just needed a crude measure. Of course, the definition of crude to Lionel's eyes and the eyes of others was vastly different. Especially when bang! The front line of Zavnik's warriors rammed into the illusory golden shield walls. They hadn't hesitated for even a moment, already imagining the scene of the shields collapsing. Even if they had been against the sturdy shields of shield cross stars, they would only have been a little hesitant, let alone now. However, to their astonishment, the first line was repelled. They soared backward, but not very far, only because there simply wasn't anywhere to go but toward the second line, then the third. The army's charge collapsed, the spearheads crumbling beneath the pressure. Lionel didn't say a word as the lion beasts shifted their stances, digging in their heels and setting a hard line of defenses. He only gave Simona an almost careless gaze, and she snapped out of her stupor. "Archers!" Simona roared. At that moment, several bird beasts soared into the skies, their archers priming their bows and releasing in waves. Lionel took a glance up into the skies, a light smile on his face. This golden family definitely fascinated him. He had put quite some effort into raising little Blackstar, and it could be said that they had some tacit understanding, but it couldn't compare to the skills of this golden family at all. Whether their beasts had more potential or strength than Blackstar was one matter, but just their coordination alone was a beautiful thing. They flew in perfect formation, raining down an assault of arrows. Pack! 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 The sound of flesh being pierced echoed throughout the battlefield, but the expected cries of agony, pain, and fear didn't follow. There were some roars, but they were all defiant, while the mass majority seemed to remain silent even in the face of death. Lionel retrieved his gaze from the top of the city walls, an amused glint in his eyes. These main soldiers of Zavnik were, indeed, excellent. "Bulldoze," Lionel said lightly. Just at that moment, it seemed that the lion beasts were wavering and their shields were about to collapse. But then they rose up from their position, roaring as they rushed forward again. Their line of shields pulsed with a light that repelled enemies. "Hold," Lionel commanded again. The lion beasts once again came to a stop after pushing the battle line just 10 or so meters, their shields flickering in and out as though they might collapse at any moment. "Bulldoze," Lionel commanded once more. They rose, rushing forward and pushing back the combat line another 10 meters. Zavnik's cold gaze watched this scene. He seemed to have a small idea now of how Lionel had accomplished so much. It seemed that the best crafter among the Nova heirs wasn't fifth Nova after all. However, it still wasn't enough. "Release," Zavnik commanded. At that moment, the 10 million strong army that was being quickly whittled down suddenly retreated. They ignored their fallen comrades and didn't make any attempt to save those that had fallen beneath their charge. They raised their polearms, some with pikes, others with halberds, and some with spears. Their armors trembled and their faces were covered by helmets, even the seams within being subtly covered. It was to the point that even their eyes couldn't be seen any longer, not even through a small slit. Each one had become like a tank, their steps causing the ground to rumble and quake. Lionel's lips suddenly curled into a grin. Chapter 2082. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:33 and 1 p.m. Chapter 2082, Blood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel seemed to see the next step before it even happened. A dense gas was released across the battlefield. The wind billowed and spread it wildly, but even so, the density was so great that it continued to sink, moving forward like a grotesque algae throughout the battlefield. The moment the gas touched the shields, they began to sizzle. The force upon them was being suffocated. Every attempt at recovering was crushed and the shields began to crack, and very soon, some of the gas began to roll up and over the shields, descending down toward the dogs below. There was no doubt. This was chemical warfare, and chemical warfare on such a large scale at that. Even in the dimensional verse, the matters of chemical and biological warfare were very much looked down upon. It could cause far too much devastation. If it wasn't for the fact that the pious family had such a deep and rich history, they may very well have been taken out by other families for nothing other than what their affinities were. This was an interesting matter, actually, because it may very well have been tied to how the pious family became acquainted with the Godlen family in the first place. This aside, the fact that Zavnik had chosen to do such a thing meant that there most definitely wasn't any coming back. He had fallen deep within Lionel's schemes already, and though he hadn't lost his head to rage, he knew that there was little he could do to reclaim his prestige currently. What mattered most was for him to secure his victory, everything after that mattered very little. One after another, the lion beasts began to grow ill and shaken. Their brownish furs turned gray and then a sickly green before their bodies began to expand as grotesque tumors started to form. Then, bang! The first lion beast exploded. Thick globules of coagulated blood spread out in all directions. At the same time, a second of the shield wall collapsed and flickered, causing an even larger surge of greenery to pass through. Indeed, although Aina had a method of curing this poison, it was still a matter of time and resources. When would she have the time to concoct 200,000 such force pills, especially when Lionel had already put so much on her plate? At the same time, due to the Leo family, these beasts had had their potential squeezed out entirely. They probably wouldn't live for even another year or two as their lifespan had been dwindled in exchange for power. As such, in Lionel's eyes, even if Aina had had the time, it probably wouldn't have been worth it to extend the resources needed toward them anyway. Zavnik's sneer deepened. However, when he saw Lionel's smiling expression hadn't vanished in the slightest, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. A paranoia had taken deep root into his heart. Without even noticing, he didn't feel as though he could trust even his own judgment anymore. Everything he did, he had to double-check how Lionel was reacting to know if he had done good or not, and this sort of situation was the worst kind of leader to be in. Especially when he was right to be worried. Boom! I think you should take a look at it happen too suddenly. The beam of reddish-golden light swept out from the gap, blowing a massive hole through the dense fog and colliding with a long line of soldiers. They didn't even have the time to react before they were blown to pieces, and before those that had survived could even register what had happened, a second explosion took place, and then a third. Each time it happened, tens of wars would fall, and the pace of the explosions only seemed to be increasing. Zavnik's eyes widened as he suddenly realized what had happened. Just now, it wasn't that the shield had shattered, it had disappeared. What Zavnik hadn't known was that Lionel had never expected for these lion beasts to survive a very long time. In fact, he hadn't expected much from them at all except their death. Lionel took quite some inspiration from Aina. Back before she gained the Blood Sovereign tablet, Aina's method of using her talent was to absorb blood force to increase her strength. Life force was the energy while the blood force was the carrier. Throughout a person's life, in order to sustain their breath, blood force would use a small amount of life force at a time. Aina was able to ignore that limiter, ripping a person's entire life's worth of blood force out for immediate use. One could imagine what years of energy expended all at once could do for a person's strength. Even if it was just 1 or 2 years. Lionel had set a function in the collars those lion beasts wore to trigger upon their death. Once the poison was sensed, all of their remaining blood force would fuse with the large amount of neutral force that had formed their shields in the first place. Once they came together, they would explode out in a beam. The process was so fast and devastating that even the poison fog that could easily corrode force didn't react fast enough to stop it. Now, every single time one of those beasts fell, it was as though they were taking down dozens within them. Zavnik was watching his army fall in real time, his eyes nearly bulging from their sockets. He could accept the loss of the other 90 million, but this 10 million were his core, the foundation of his strength. It had taken a great deal of effort to raise them up. Retreat! Zavnik roared. He couldn't stop himself anymore. He leapt up with such ferocity that the wooden carriage beneath him exploded into countless pieces. He pulled out a spear and shot into the skies, rushing toward Lionel like a madman. He had to stop this. He couldn't continue to be played like this. He wanted blood. Chapter 2083. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:32 and 59 seconds p.m. Chapter 2083. Much more interesting if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Lionel raised up his hands. Why all of this animosity? Suddenly, Lionel's hands shifted and he pointed his two forefingers up to the sky as he shook his head. He looked as though he was reprimanding Zavnik for being too reckless. What was this? He was still the leader. How was it helpful for him to get so hot-headed? Rumble. Zavnik only now seemed to realize that there was a storm brewing in the skies. The gloominess of the earlier atmosphere made it easy to ignore, plus it hadn't mattered to him much if it rained or not. What difference did it make? But once again, seeing Lionel's smiling expression, he began to rethink his whole life. He double-thought and triple-thought through things, his self-doubt creeping up from all corners. He roared into the skies, his frustration reaching a breaking point as he thrust his spear forward. He seemed to cleave the skies in two, a truly devastating attack that almost threatened to disperse the coming storm above. He didn't seem to care about anything anymore. If he couldn't guess what Lionel would do next, he would just crush it with brute strength. What good were schemes in the face of absolute strength? Unfortunately, in his rage, he seemed to have forgotten that Lionel had the spear domain ring. And, even if he hadn't, what good was a spear in the face of a true spear sovereign? The powerful attack that caused the sky and earth below to split suddenly dissipated when he entered the range of Lionel's absolute domain. It no longer even had to touch him, collapsing tens of meters away. Lionel clicked his tongue. I tried to warn you. You dash. Bang. Tens of streaks of lightning descended from the skies all at once, bombarding into Zavnik before he could even realize what was happening. He had been so enraged, so infuriated, that he had completely lost himself. His vision had blurred, his only focal point being Lionel himself. But this sort of suffocating reality was exactly what caused him to be a charred mess on the ground. Zavnik lay in a pit, looking into the skies in a daze. The attack he had taken just now had been responsible for wiping out several air-grade upgrade challenge armies, except while those had targeted many, he was the only target for this one. It could be said that the fact he was still alive at all was truly a surprise for Lionel, but it wasn't as though this surprise would appear on his face. To the current Zavnik, Lionel was practically omnipotent. Even to the current Lionel, this was also true. Ever since he had awakened from that odd dream, he felt as though the entire world was nothing more than a joke. He didn't even have to put much effort into crushing his so-called enemies. It only took a few words and Zavnik had become clay putty in his hands. The army below found themselves in a state of chaos. Their commander's life and death were unknown to them, and they were now being crushed by wave after wave of what could only be described as suicide bombings. It was truly unlike anything they had ever experienced before. Under Zavnik's rule, they couldn't remember ever losing. Even against the best geniuses of the human domain, they had always had the utmost confidence. They couldn't believe they were losing to a youth they had hardly given any regard to in the past. The worst part was that he hadn't even lifted a finger. From start to finish, he had only said some words and then pointed to the sky, and now they were actually in this sort of situation. Suffocating. It was a word that came up again and again, but it was the complete reality. I think you should take a look at the members of Zavnik's army, or rather those that had once been a part of it, had retreated far into the distance. Many had escaped outright, looking for places to hide. Although they had left Zavnik, they too had an innate trust in his abilities and as such, many of them had been so certain that he would still win that their only thoughts were of looking for places to hide so that they wouldn't run into him again before the air wars ended. Only a small percentage remained, either confident in their escape abilities or believing that Zavnik couldn't possibly get them all, especially not without destroying his reputation further. But even these people had still believed he would win. Until now. They almost couldn't believe the gap. Were they really sure that they were of the same generation? Were they certain that this wasn't an old monster taking over the skin of a youth? Was this really the littlest Nova? The human domain didn't know how to respond to this situation. They had seen Lionel create miracle after miracle, but it had never been this easy. They didn't know what had happened to Lionel, or maybe that break he took was really exactly what he needed, but they felt that even the current him put the past him to shame. Lionel took a step and leapt down from the city walls, his expression calm as he came beside the pit that Zavnik was in and then dove within, picking up third Nova by his neck and holding him up. The current Zavnik was still in a daze, not quite knowing where he was. Or maybe he did know and simply didn't want to acknowledge it. I guess it's best if things end this way. Go on your way, Lionel said with a light smile. His hand moved towards Zavnik's chest to shatter his badge, but at the same time, his gaze flashed with a deep purple light. Clearly, he planned to use the same method he had on Anya's sister to keep Zavnik under his control. He could wrap up these air wars quickly and then take his time to interrogate Zavnik. Even if Zavnik was in full health, Lionel wouldn't fear doing this. But he had still so diligently taken his time to completely crush and eviscerate Zavnik's psyche, all so that this moment couldn't have been any easier. Even as he began the process, Zavnik remained in a daze, unable to react, and Lionel knew that he had won. But at that moment, just when his seal was about to implant itself, Zavnik's shadow moved. Lionel's pupils constricted as he flashed away, his body vanishing and a clone appearing in its place. He watched his clone be severed into two and as Zavnik's body was swallowed whole by the shadow and swept away. He didn't react to this matter very much, looking down at his wrist. He grabbed out with his other hand, catching his severed hand before it could fall to the ground. Lionel chuckled despite having lost a hand. Well, this is much more interesting. That shadow had been so well hidden that even his senses hadn't picked it up. But as well concealed as it was, its speed was even more impressive. His reaction speed was practically second to none, at least within this generation, and he didn't believe that anyone could get by Ancestor Hito's rules. But he had actually still lost a hand. Interesting indeed. Chapter 2084. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 56 seconds p.m. Chapter 2084. Not bad if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. A large surge of light force took shape and, instant recovery, was cast once more. Lionel attached his hands to his wrist and they seemed to seamlessly fuse in an instant, without even the slightest effort. He was in perfect condition just a few moments later. He thought back to that shadow and couldn't help but have several thoughts about the matter. Was that a shadow's sovereign ability? It wasn't impossible, though it felt slightly different. This was especially so the three-finger cult seemed to have a fascination with shadow sovereigns to begin with. They definitely had the highest concentration of such experts in the whole of the human domain. Lionel shook his head and looked toward Aina. Is it enough? Aina took a gaze at the still flowing cloud of poison and shook her head. It's way too much. Lionel laughed. That was a good thing. It was better to have too much than to have too little. This made things much easier and the amount of effort Aina would need to put in was much less. It was just unfortunate they had traded in the lives of so many lion beasts for this result. The Sky's family and Oryx's family only had worshipful gazes. They hadn't known all of Lionel's plans, but seeing everything go so smoothly made them feel that it didn't matter much. They hadn't even been forced to put their lives on the end. All of them had been there when Lionel had spoken to Zavnik, and many of them had even been skeptical about what it was that Lionel was trying to accomplish by handing over so much information. But seeing that even such a thing had worked out for them perfectly in the end, there was simply nothing that they could muster aside from deep admiration at this point. It felt like they were witnessing the rise of an emperor, but he already had all the intelligence, bearing, and even experience that he should have only gained in the future. Lionel finally looked towards Simona and the others. He hadn't originally come to the Morales with the belief that the pious family would be on his side. As he had said back then, he didn't know much about the Godlen family to begin with. However, the more he learned, the more intrigued he was. If there could be one such hidden family, why couldn't there be more? He even wondered if this Godland family was similar to the Brazingers and the other three of the four great families. He still had a lot of questions in his mind about the purpose of this world and that of the people trying to interfere with it. For example, were the Brazingers and Three-Finger Cult on the same side? If they weren't, then how was it that the creators of this world had allowed their enemies into an important thing? Or was it that the figures behind the Three-Finger Cult and the four great families were all just different factions of the same power, so they all had equal access but different thoughts on how things should proceed? Or maybe it was that the nature of such a simulation in the first place necessitated that it be vulnerable to the influence of outsiders? He truly did have too many questions and not enough answers. He even had half a mind to start interrogating Anya's sister, but he honestly very much doubted that she would have many answers. I think you should take a look at. For some reason, although Harmony was apparently the elder sister, Anya felt far more unfathomable to Lionel. The fact that they were twins made even less sense to him. There was definitely something important related to this matter, but he also had a feeling that it wouldn't be long before he met that woman again. This time, it was less likely that they would still be so friendly. Even though he had all of these questions, Lionel didn't make any effort to ask Simona about them. As far as he was concerned, she likely didn't know as much as he hoped, and if he began to ask even roundabout questions, it opened him up to potentially being exposed by others. Simona was just as cold as he remembered her, although her gaze carried a hint of something different when she looked at him. It seemed to be a surprise and a tinge of respect. Simona had probably, rightfully, looked down on most of her generation. She was seen as on par with them despite having the vast majority of her talents sealed, so she never really took any of them seriously. When she lost that battle against Aina, she had very much wanted her revenge, but she hadn't expected things to turn out this way in the end. Those deserters are pretty useful, Lionel suddenly said. Can you send some people to round them up? It'll make things much more convenient later on. Simona blinked before she nodded slowly. She looked toward the young man with the flaming black lion beast to her side and he understood, immediately taking action to give out orders. It will be difficult to use them in battle. Most of them only participated to be under Zavnik to begin with. Those that have already given up that dream only really fall into two camps. The first, and likely the largest majority, are simply done with the air wars and want nothing else but to wait for things to die out until they are transported out. The second group is likely the minority and they might have realized that with so few of us remaining, they might still have a chance to become their own heirs. It has to be remembered that most of them entered as heirs on their own, so they don't need to wait for Zavnik to escape. Of those that remain, they probably just want to maintain some of their face or see if they have a chance at becoming the ultimate winner. Lionel chuckled when he heard Simona's analysis. That's not bad analysis, indeed. You're missing something, though. Chapter 2085. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 55 seconds p.m. Chapter 2085. Obvious if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Simona frowned when she heard Lionel's words. If it had been someone else who said this, she might have directly attacked. She didn't like the tone, and she liked the fact there was no explanation afterward even less. The current Lionel was far more condescending than he was charming, but it was difficult to refute that he deserved this sort of arrogance. Then again, Simona felt that she was thinking too much. In reality, the issue wasn't with Lionel's tone, but rather that he so seamlessly began to talk to her like a subordinate, something that left her uncomfortable. She had, indeed, agreed to help Lionel in order to return a favor, but she hadn't subordinated herself to him. These two things couldn't be equated. Lionel had just spoken like she was any of his other followers. He hadn't been disrespectful, but the implication had irritated her. Simona took a breath and shook her head. Indeed, in this situation, she was meant to be a subordinate even if she didn't like it. She wasn't here to fight for her own heirship, but rather that of Lionel's. She had followed all of his plans up until here, and it could be said that without his guidance, she would have been taken out like the other Constellation families already. The Godland family was unable to exhibit their full strength here, so left to her own devices, she would have had to flee already. This was probably what happened due to the odd nature of their partnership. She knew too little about Lionel and was only here to repay a heavy favor. In addition, her pious family cared less about outward prestige, or else her mother would have never married her father to begin with, so she was in a unique position to return this favor. Shaking her head, Simona waved a hand to the young man who had already returned, causing his brows to unfurrow. I was in the wrong to begin with. I questioned his methods when he's clearly already come to a decision. He was already respectful enough, Simona said lightly. The young man didn't say anything to this. Since Simona had spoken, he accepted it. Even if he had felt that she was wrong, he wouldn't have voiced it. That didn't sound very smooth, Aina suddenly said when Lionel returned to her side. This not explaining things habit of yours will get you into trouble. Lionel smiled. It's not too big of a deal, whether she's on board or not doesn't make much of a difference to me. Lionel could have asked the Oryx or the Skies, or better yet Aina and the others to round up the 90 million that had escaped, but he hadn't. Instead, he had gone out of his way to ask Simona to do it, and that was to draw a clear line. That look that Simona had given to the young man with the black flaming lion was all Lionel needed to see. If he was going to command people, he needed them to be perfectly in sync with him. Those that thought they could do things better were only a liability and nothing more. I think you should take a look at this was also why during the battle, he had only asked for a minor amount of help from Simona, enough that it wouldn't be too obvious that he was making a statement, but also little enough that it would be obvious to them that he hadn't come on bended knee for their assistance. The peculiarity of their relationship lent itself to this sort of outcome. Lionel was very good at reading the intentions and emotions of others, so it wasn't something that escaped his grasp in the slightest. The hard truth was that from an outside observer's perspective, Lionel had done very little to end up with a lot. No matter how important the little puppy was to Simona, he hadn't even known that when he came across it, and the puppy could have easily been found by anyone else. Of course, there were other matters about that event that made Simona endlessly grateful, like the fact he hadn't sacrificed the puppy at the altar of his speedy progression and increase in strength, but humans were also interesting creatures. It was all too easy for gratitude to turn to complacency and complacency to turn into disdain. If you did too much for someone, they could very easily take your kindness to just be a matter of fact, and regardless of how helpful Lionel had been to restoring her future potential, it was a fact that it was still something that anyone could have done. Human nature could easily ignore the deeds of the extraordinary if it happened too often, let alone when the deed wasn't very extraordinary at all. But at the same time, Lionel's grasp of human nature was extremely profound. He had targeted the problem before it even truly became one. Now, whether Simona would remember that and take it into consideration moving forward, he didn't know. That much would be up to her. But like he said, he didn't really care much either way. If she didn't know what was best for her, or if her godlen or pious family wanted to stand up for her, then in his eyes, the result wouldn't be very much different. It would only mean one extra buried enemy. Nothing more, nothing less. So then what do you actually want to do with them, then? Aina looked at Lionel. Clearly, she had no intention of letting him skirt off like Simona had. If not, she had a few strong waist pinches in store. Lionel grinned when he saw the dangerous look in her eye. Well, just think about it. Everyone on this continent knows about Zavnik and almost none of them know that he's been defeated, at least for the time being. Did you see how uniform and monocolored their army was? Nice and organized if you ask me, very cool uniforms as well, top class. Third Nova did well. Lionel's grin became wider. Aina's gaze flickered, although Lionel hadn't answered, the implications were all too obvious. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 2086. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 53 seconds p.m. Chapter 2086. Wanted if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again as expected. Most of those who remained of Zavnik's subordinates were not fans of what Lionel was trying to do, and that was especially so for those of them that had survived the explosion of lion beasts. However, even for this latter group, it was only a matter of allowing James, Elther, and the others to have some fun of their own. The moment they took action, the weakened remaining members found themselves crushed. Out of curiosity, Lionel took one of their armors. But after a glance, he shook his head. He guessed that it was decent, at the gold grade, that is. But it wasn't anything worthy of turning his head. If anything, it was just a waste of materials, albeit impressive that Zavnik managed to gather so much materials to waste in the first place. Had Zavnik known Lionel's thoughts at this moment, he might have been angered to the point of aggravating all of his injuries. But these were just Lionel's true sentiments. The current him felt that even his most recent crafts weren't up to par, let alone the crafts of others. This aside, it didn't particularly matter to Lionel that these armors weren't very good. What was most important was that they were easily recognizable. That was right. Lionel planned to use the illusion of Zavnik to deal with those that remained. After he finished, it would be about time to have the final battle between himself and Amory. The first he had lost, the second he had won, and this third one would conclude the saga. Although his expression didn't seem to show much, he could still remember that day all too clearly. Lionel's gaze flickered with something unrecognizable, his lip curling. Suddenly, he moved, vanishing. When he appeared again, his palm descended upon Isomson's head with such force that the latter's knees crashed to the ground, leaving 2 deep pits. Isomson couldn't even resist. He grit his teeth hard, but there was simply no fighting against it. Although he was outwardly enraged, his heart itself was palpitating. He had never thought that Lionel's individual strength was actually so great. From beginning to end, it had felt like he had relied on nothing more than his mind. It was to the point that Isomson hadn't even reacted to Lionel's movement, not believing that the latter would dare to react. This sudden change didn't catch just him off guard, but the others who had been rounded up as well, not to mention the members of the Pious and Godlen family that were observing from the city walls. Their expressions all changed. One moment, Lionel was smiling, and in the next, he had released an explosive energy they were certain over 90% of them couldn't hope to counter. And that was despite him not having stepped foot into the 7th dimension yet. "Don't glare at me," Lionel said with a smile. He bent down, resting the hamstrings on his heels as he looked the kneeling Isomson into the eye. With a flash, a strong violet force descended and Isomson felt as though his mind had been imprinted. "You probably don't need me to explain to what that is, right? Your only use to me is to command the rest of these people," Lionel spoke and then looked up. "As for the rest of you all, you will listen to him. Of course, if you're obedient and attack as I tell you, those of you that survive I won't touch. In fact, once I become the heir of the Morales family, I'll use my power to make sure that Zavnik can't target your families on the back end. I think you should take a look at the upper echelons watching this scene were probably grinding their teeth. To them, Zavnik was their leader and they understood the backstory behind all these matters. Unfortunately, these youths had no idea and ate Lionel's words up. Of course, they also believed that Lionel had no idea what was going on. If they knew that he was well aware, their teeth might very well shatter from grinding so much. The fact he knew made this matter all the more sinister. Hearing Lionel's words, the rounded-up subordinates slowly nodded. Those of them that had had hopes of becoming the new winners realized how foolish their thoughts had been. They had been crushed with just a little effort on Simona's part. How could they have lasted until the end? Lionel himself hadn't even made a move. In their eyes, Lionel was of course the greatest threat. The Pious family didn't compare to the Morales family, and it was Lionel who had crushed Zavnik's army with just a few words and schemes. So, the fact that it was Simona and not Lionel that crushed them made them give up all of their dreams before they could even manifest. As for those that had just wanted to last until the end and survive, Lionel's words about protecting their families were the greatest lure. Once again, just with a few seemingly minor and unimportant decisions, Lionel had dealt with the situation perfectly, gripping onto the weaknesses of both groups with just a single action. "Good," Lionel said with a light smile. "Your task is simple, the only thing you'll do is attack the spirituals' religion, just like you planned to do originally." The expressions of many changed. Without the backing of Zavnik, and considering the fact most of their best elite troops had been crushed, this was practically suicide. However, in the end, they could only grit their teeth. They truly didn't have much of a choice. Lionel nodded to himself. In truth, they were thinking too much. It was precisely because Zavnik wasn't present and the elite troops were nowhere to be seen that they would survive. What would one think if an easily recognizable army suddenly appeared without their centerpieces? Wouldn't they be wary? Wouldn't they be hesitant? Wouldn't they be on a constant lookout for where Zavnik might appear? And that was exactly what Lionel wanted. Chapter 2087. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:32 and 51 seconds p.m. Chapter 2087. Whetstone. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Suyard family had been very silent in this span of time. It could even be said that they were quite silent throughout the air wars. Amory hadn't seemed to be very interested in expanding his territory, and he hadn't even made much headway toward the ocean. In fact, his territory was actually quite a distance from the coast despite the fact that he did, indeed, control all the land between this place and it. From the beginning, the only large-scale clash that the Suyard family had had was actually against their only ally. It was quite ironic, actually. But other than this, Amory had truly not done much. It was as though he was waiting for someone he knew would definitely come. This stance by the Suyard family was truly baffling. That was because they were considered to be the de facto leaders of the sword families of the human domain, and unlike the Morales family that never really cared to gather up all the spear masters, the Suyard family actually had subordinated many of them. As such, if Amory had wanted, he could have been a lot like Zavnik, gathering up many heirs under his banner and using it to sweep through the competition. But he hadn't. Why would he waste his time with such a thing? He wasn't like the trash of the Morales family. The Suyard family had their own version of the air wars, but it didn't have the bounds of a competition, it didn't have a start date or end date, nor were there rules against killing. The only rule was that no one beneath the seventh dimension could be targeted, only then would they become part of the boundless competition. However, before even entering the seventh dimension, in fact even before entering the sixth, all of Amory's brothers had already submitted to him. He had been the decided leader of the Suyard family ever since he was 12 years old. He didn't have competition in his generation, nor did he take anyone seriously. Even his so-called fiancée, a half-spiritual, was no match for him. If it wasn't for the face of his family, he wouldn't have cared to come in the first place. In reality, he really only had two goals for this trip. The first was to conveniently deal with that guy they insisted on calling the Bao deity. As far as he was concerned, that guy was far too annoying. Placing another on his level was a bit ridiculous. The second was even simpler, and that was to defeat whoever was last to remain and came to challenge him for ultimate victory. Nothing more, nothing less. He didn't really give a damn about anything else. And finally, it seemed that that day had come. Amory slowly opened his eyes. Up in the skies, a young man stood with a smile on his face. But just this simple smile made Amory's pupils constrict. That was because it was too casual, too relaxed. It felt like Lionel wasn't even here for him, but was rather here to conveniently deal with him since he was obstructing his path. Of course, Amory remembered that he had suffered defeat at Lionel's hands, but he never took that matter to heart. As his grandfather had said, there was no room for excuses, so he would willingly allow Lionel that victory. But that didn't mean that he had to take the man himself seriously. Back then, Lionel had used a treasure bao to increase his bao force usage. In truth, Amory could have disregarded that usually as well, if it wasn't for the fact most of his strength was sealed away while suppressing the tribulation. Knowing this, it was only natural that he didn't take Lionel seriously. In fact, he hadn't even thought that Lionel would be among the last standing. Amory slowly stood to his feet. I think you should take a look at. He stood within the top floor of a tower. While the others did, this floor in particular didn't have glass windows, opening them up to the weather. The window billowed as he took a step forward, appearing in the skies as well. He didn't seem intent on drawing his blade. Looking at Lionel's calm smile despite how close he was, Amory's expression remained placid. Even against a seventh-dimensional existence, at this distance, it would only take a thought for Amory to kill them. Suddenly. Shiying. The howl of a sword echoed and the violence of a sharpening blade split the skies. A rotating cyclone of sword force formed in an instant. It was so fast that its manifestation wasn't seen. However, roar! The spiraling manifestation of spear force formed just as fast, rotating around Lionel's body and clashing with Amory's cyclone. Two young men stood in the skies, their force grinding against one another. It looked as though two mighty golden hurricanes had formed in the skies, creating two eyes of the storm that shredded everything in their path apart. The entire city was thrown into disorder. Members of the Sina family and the other lower-level sword families, along with members of the Sword family, had already been alerted to Lionel's arrival long ago. But before they could react, he had already made it to Amory, making them realize that this was definitely no simple opponent. Seeing this, their gazes were painted with horror as they all retreated at their fastest speed, dodging out of the way of flying shards of glass, collapsing buildings, and most important, residual blades of spear and sword force. Suddenly, it all came to a stop. Amory's robes fluttered as Lionel's linen shirt threatened to fly from his body, clinging against his torso with such force under the harsh winds that every peak and crevice of his chiseled physique could be seen. Amory was silent. Of all the things he had thought would happen, he would have never guessed that Lionel's spear force would actually be on the same level as his sword force. No. Technically he was a level below. He had already formed 7th-dimensional sword force, but he could actually only be equal to Lionel's 6th-dimensional spear force. Without a word, Amory slowly pulled out 2 swords, his gaze tranquil. Those days he spent in the tribulation were some of the best days of his life. He had simply never met anyone on his level before. He had faced a bottleneck in his sword force for too long. It was about time a whetstone came to him. Erdeel notes, I remember when Amory was actually sort of an interesting character, but in the end he truly just manifested into a typical young master. A shame. Chapter 2088. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 48 seconds p.m. Chapter 2088. Confident if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel smiled, his demeanor relaxed. You seem to be quite confident. Amory looked into Lionel's eyes. It was hard to tell what he was thinking. He seemed to have the same level of indifference no matter the situation. Back when he was defeated in Lionel's hands, he had the same casual expression. After a brief instant of suppressing his lineage factor from activating, he reacted quite normally. In truth, his reaction was quite muted. It had to be remembered that his goal from the very beginning was the egg. Unlike Lionel, he had every intention of taking on the Shadow Sovereign lineage for himself. Such a thing would have given him 3 lineage factors, placing him beyond almost anyone who had ever existed. Not only that, but all 3 of his lineage factors would be exceptionally powerful. But that had been snatched from him. The fact that he had decisively left and managed to rein in his temper, even to the point that he didn't even bother to target Lionel personally after that event, although there were definitely opportunities to do so, went a lot towards showing Lionel exactly the kind of person this man was. However, it was also precisely this sort of attitude that Lionel wanted to knock down a peg. Not targeting him afterward was a sign of clear disregard. He simply hadn't cared enough about Lionel to do so, and even now, he seemed to think that it would be a simple matter to take a step forward. In Amory's mind, it was only right that Lionel had grown to this point. Lionel had been under a lot of pressure, forced to grow faster, otherwise he might very well lose his life. As for him, he had never been under such pressure in his life. Every challenge he had come across, he had always shattered with just a single swing of his sword. He hadn't faced any sort of adversity, and yet he had grown to this point. The truth was that he very much hoped that Lionel was as powerful as he seemed. Maybe in this lifetime, he could finally have a real challenge. He had had a taste of that during his tribulation. He had come across all sorts of powerful existences that pushed him to his limits, and his growth then was far beyond anything he had ever experienced in the human domain. However, it had already been a small while since then. It was about time he had a second. Lionel didn't seem to expect Amory to respond, nor did he care to listen to his response. Instead, he looked down toward the ring on Amory's finger. That ring, I have someone who would be far better suited for it. I'll be taking it off your hands today. Lionel said these words without the slightest hint of emotion in his tone. His smile had entirely vanished, nothing but the vacant depths of his eyes staring forward as though an endless abyss was hidden within. He returned Amory the words that he had said all that time ago. That day, he had nearly lost his hand, and if not for Anastasia's awakening, his path of crafting may have been cut off forever, or at the very least, crippled. Lionel didn't take very many things seriously, but what he absolutely abhorred was disrespect. I think you should take a look at respect and persistence. These were the two things that he had built his life upon. And whenever he didn't receive the sort of reciprocation he believed that he deserved, the only thing he felt was a bubbling up of fury. His body flashed with a blinding bronze aura, his divine armor clicking into place. The violent and raging aura of a pillar that seemed to connect the earth below and the skies above manifested, his 10 stars flooding his body with power. He took a step forward and the air beneath him cracked and shattered. It looked as though space itself was collapsing, a sight that shook those below to their core, especially as the ground immediately beneath his feet rippled. A hole with edges as smooth as a mirror took shape, almost as though someone had stamped a god's pillar down and then quickly removed it. Amory's fingers trembled and a sword light suddenly appeared before Lionel. With a slash, Lionel shattered it, his body flickering and vanishing and appearing before Amory in an instant. The wind wrapped around his descending black rod, forming a howling barrier that echoed through the city. Amory, wrists flexed, his movements smooth and unhurried, but despite his seemingly slow movement, his sword seemed to reach the perfect location at just the right time. Bang! Billowing steam-like forces surged in all directions, a violent black sword force from Amory and a radiant violet and blue spear force from Lionel. It felt as though the two were dividing the world between the two of them, painting reality in their own colors and leaving an indelible mark behind for the countless generations to follow. They separated and suddenly rushed forward once more. Lionel's spear spun and moved in elegant arcs no less beautiful than Amory's swinging swords. It was hard to believe that such a gorgeous sight could come from a spear at all. The Lionel of today and the one Amory had met couldn't even be said to be on the same level. That Lionel only knew how to simplify and use the crudest and most direct actions. This Lionel seemed to see the entire board, carrying both the systematic and rigid rules of the game, while also having the flair of ingenious, brilliant movement that could only come from a deep well of creativity. Every time they clashed, another large swath of the city collapsed, flattened beneath their might, but neither one of them seemed to be going all out. Their gazes seemed to clash more than even their weapons. They tracked one another through the air, the sounds and reverberating impacts of their weapons unable to obstruct their meeting eyes in the slightest. Chapter 2089. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 46 seconds p.m. Chapter 2089. 2. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Amory's style suddenly changed. He shifted to the side, drawing a circular arc with one sword and piercing straight forward with the other. His hands moved independently of one another, a beautiful display of duality. It looked as though he was drawing a bow and arrow across the air. Bang! The arrow cut through the skies, appearing before Lionel's throat in an instant. However, with just a flicker of Lionel's eyes, the arrow vanished into thin air. He didn't even bother to block or slow his attack, slashing down toward Amory's exposed shoulder. Amory's pupils constricted. He hadn't expected this to happen in the slightest and was a bit late to react. Even so, his speed was exceptional. Rather than moving his feet, it was his attack speed that was on full display instead. The sword that had been drawing the body of a bow through the air continued its elegant arc, slipping the side of Lionel's spear body and parrying it off to the side. At the same time, he shifted his stance forward, closing the advantage of range Lionel's weapon gave him to continue thrusting his piercing sword forward. His two arms seemed to work on their own and together at once, forming an airtight defense that could react and shift on its own. He didn't seem to have to think before he reacted at all, his body in a seamless sort of higher state. Lionel shifted his own stance, the void star force star to his back pulsing once before a force art seemed to be completed in an instant. Amory felt as though his thrust had slowed considerably and yet sped up at the same time. It was an eerie feeling that made it difficult to tell which way was up and which was down, but by the time he had begun to unravel the mysteries, Lionel's parried spear had spun in his hands, recovering and sweeping back with a momentum that made the air crackle and pop. Bang! Amory blocked with his second sword with a deft precision, his first thrust sword barely stopping before Lionel's chest as he ran out of momentum. He didn't quite have enough strength to fight back, his body being sent flying to the side and losing a bit of the initiative. Lionel thrust several times in the skies, the tip of his spear vanishing and suddenly fusing several strikes into one as they appeared before Amory just as the latter had lost his balance. Even in this situation, Amory's calm hadn't changed in the slightest. His absolute sword domain rumbled to life, but just when it seemed that he would use it to defend, its purpose changed entirely. Amory struck out with his sword several times and his absolute sword domain vanished, forming 3 cyclones that appeared around Lionel all at once. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He took a step and vanished through space, dodging out of the way of the approaching cyclones, but Amory had already recovered, using the spine of his sword to block his attack. The level of skill and confidence in oneself it took to do such a thing was entirely off the charts. However, despite the fact both seemed to be doing impossible things, they didn't blink even a single time. It seemed to come naturally to the two of them, their cold indifference weighing heavily on the hearts of the spectators as they vanished once again. It felt like every single one of their clashes were just as deadly, each one carrying a close shave with death that both of them had to dance with. And yet, despite this, they were entirely unmoved. I think you should take a look at by the dozenth exchange. Lionel was absolutely certain that Amory, too, had an analytical ability index. In fact, it might very well be one with an exceptionally high dream force affinity as well because he was entirely unmoved by Lionel's clones. Amory seemed to have decided that this was the case for Lionel as well, and as though they had both come to some sort of tacit understanding, their gazes lost their placidness and became incomparably vicious in an instant. In that moment, when the flip switched, they seemed to have become entirely different people. Their howls filled the air and a violent sort of momentum started to come from their bodies, an aura that could only be described as demonic. Amory's pale skin began to redden and the billowing blue vital star force coming from Lionel became a blinding sheen of crimson. Bang! The air around them exploded. Amory's swords crossed and Lionel grabbed his spear with both hands so forcefully that the polearm almost creaked and warped. It was a violent clash, even more so than the past ones. If the others flattened the land, this one devastated it. Their forces were entirely wild and out of control, expanding in all directions without a thought for stamina or those around them. Lionel grinned wildly, a crimson force billowing from him, forming a sparkling nebulae in the skies. It felt as though he had become the center of his own universe. At the same time, Amory's eyes had become entirely red, such a deep shade, in fact, that it looked more magenta than it did red. His long hair whipped about wildly with such fierceness that it almost looked as though they wanted to fly away on their own. Veins popped up across their bodies, Amory's exposed and Lionel's hidden beneath his divine armor. Their momentum rose like a tide and suddenly, 2 gems on the back of Amory's hands began to glow with their own light. One was such a deep jet black that if not for the surge of crimson, it would have been impossible to spot in the first place. The other could only be described as bloody. Its light was incredibly heavy and almost liquid, dripping down his hands and fingers. Even in his current state, Lionel recognized them immediately. Innate nodes. Not just one, but 2. Chapter 2090. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 45 seconds p.m. Chapter 2090. Born if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Innate nodes were incredibly rare, so much so that it was practically well accepted that only the spirituals race could produce them. Even when humans formed them, they were usually exceptionally low-level innate nodes. Someone like Lionel who not only had one, but one of exceptionally high quality like the Scarlet Star Force innate node, was entirely unheard of. Even so, Even Lionel didn't have 2 innate nodes. Although he technically had 3 right now, one of them was regrown, the second was taken back from the one who had stolen it from him in the first place, and the final one was snatched from one of his enemies. The fact that Amory had not just 1, but 2 himself, and in such a perfect location for himself at that, was something that maybe only the highest echelon members of the Seward family had been aware of. And that was because Amory had simply never needed to use them against those of his generation. At that moment, the winds howled. Spiraling cyclones of force formed around Amory's swords, one wrapped in a deep, abyssal black light, and the other looking as though it had been coated in blood. The black force, there was no doubt in Lionel's mind, was definitely dark force. This wasn't a low-level innate node at all. Dark and light force were considered to be above most elemental forces and only below forces like dream and star force. The fact that Lionel had had a light force affinity had already been a shocking matter to the people of Earth back when the metamorphosis had just descended, and that was the location with the greatest concentration of talent in the entire human domain. If he had been exposed to have a light force innate node, the reactions wouldn't have been so muted. But then there was that odd liquid red force. It looked almost like blood at first gaze, and Lionel had truly thought it to be a blood force innate node. However, the longer he observed it for, the more he felt that this was probably not the case. There was something different about this force. It seemed to carry a hint of water force, another hint of earth force, and a final hint of life force. That was when it hit Lionel. He had only vaguely heard about this force, and that was only after he had gone through the entirety of the Void Library. If not for this, he might not even recognize this force, much like he hadn't recognized breaking force back then. This was Gaia force. This odd fusion of water, earth and life force was precisely Gaia force. Its abilities were extremely enigmatic. Not only could it be extremely heavy, but it could borrow power from the earth and that of large bodies of water. This borrowed power would become the strength of the user, an almost infinite well of strength. Lionel was absolutely certain that it had more abilities likely related to why Amory had actually dared to use the imagery of a bow and arrow to attack him earlier. This wasn't for certain, but what was absolutely certain was the fact that this Gaia force was most definitely a high-level force, a force on the same level as Scarlet Star Force without a doubt. It seemed that this was likely the reason the spirituals' religion had agreed to marry their demigoddess to him. Is that so? Lionel said lightly, his grin becoming wilder. 2 innate nodes? I have that, too. Boom. Lionel's aura exploded forth like a collapsing star. His innate nodes began to glow with such force that they shimmered through his divine armor. But just when it seemed that his Scarlet Star Force would burn through, something changed. His armor trembled, its crevices beginning to glow with a crimson light. Just when the crimson light was about to take over entirely, a silver-gold light flowed to meet it. 2 vein patterns, one red-gold, and the other silver-gold, met and intertwined in a beautiful sort of dance. I think you should take a look at his Tier 1 armor was made of materials too weak to enter this state, but who had said that he had shown everything his Tier 2 armor could do? Amory and Lionel stood off across from one another, their auras reaching their peak. At that moment, on the outside, sitting as the observers, the Seward family stood to their feet. They had all felt that this matter would only end in one way, but they had never expected that even before the battle could ramp up, Amory had brought out one of his greatest trump cards so casually. He hadn't been pushed into a corner, his stamina wasn't running out, he hadn't even been injured yet, and yet he had chosen to make this move. There was only one explanation for why. He felt that Lionel was an equal opponent, and an opponent that he should go all out against before he lost the chance to. When they reached this conclusion, they felt that it was too difficult to accept. That was because there was only one person who was on such a level, and that was precisely the #1 queen beauty of this generation, the spiritual religion heiress. How could there be a second? Even with all of this said, Lionel and Amory seemed to have forgotten about the world all around them. As the skies collapsed and the ground crumbled, they stood in silence for just a moment before they clashed. Their speeds were so fast that their afterimages seemed to still be standing in the air, having not moved at all. In fact, their afterimages had yet to even fade by the time they returned to their same exact locations, blood trickling from both of their lips. Horns began to slowly grow from Amory's forehead as 3 tails extended from Lionel's back, growing so large that their swinging motion stirred the clouds in the sky. A silence fell. Bang! The aftershock of their exchange finally exploded forth, leveling the entire city to the ground. The human domain watched with rapt attention. Just how many trump cards did these 2 youths have? But most importantly, the spear deity seemed to have been born in that moment. Chapter 2091. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:32 and 43 seconds p.m. Chapter 2091. Impenetrable by wind. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's spear was surrounded by a spiraling red gold and silver gold light. It wrapped around it tightly, dancing as though they had minds of their own. His arm and his spear seemed to have become one. By extension, his armor and his spear seemed to have likewise fused into one. The phantom of a roaring panda barely took shape, his 3 long fox tails continuing to stir the clouds in the skies. Across from him, Amory seemed to have grown a size, towering to over 7 feet. His horns were menacing, and the depths of his crimson eyes looked as though one was staring into the depth of an erupting volcano. His swords trembled slightly under the tightness of his grip, one dripping with a viscous force that looked no different from streaks of thick blood, and the other emitting plumes of endless dark force so dense that the shape of its body was impossible to spot perfectly. The skies trembled around the both of them, the muted hums of their weapons causing mountains to quake and the air to split around them, unwilling to get close for fear of being severed to their very roots. Bang! Lionel moved with an impossible-to-track speed, the billowing steam of force surging from the valves of his divine armor becoming a pair of fiery wings that blotted out the skies. Amory didn't seem to move an inch, or rather, his legs didn't. His arms instead became blurs, meeting the dance of Lionel's spear without a hint of calm. His aura became savage, his blades wanting for blood and his gaze piercing like streaks of red lightning. His dark force sword was ethereal and difficult to track. It seemed to slip in and out of the shadows, a sinister dance of subtlety and shrewdness making it almost impossible to track. His Gaia Force sword was akin to crashing waves. It was heavy and relentless, carrying the weight of the earth and the persistence of trickling water. It was all held together by a surging life force, endless and unfathomable. Lionel's own spear didn't seem to have a direct style at all, but its flexibility and smoothness was undeniable. Sometimes it was speedy, others time forceful, yet other times crafty and still yet direct. His skill alone made spear masters blush with shame. They couldn't fathom such a use having grasped such a skill in a weapon they had dedicated centuries to. The 2 didn't seem to be moving at all. If it wasn't for the blur of their arms and the destruction of the world around him, it would be impossible to tell that they were battling at all. At the same time, it was as though each were wielding dozens of blades. Amory's swords appeared from all sorts of angles, hundreds of blade tips and edges separating through space, attacking Lionel from all sides. As for Lionel's spear, even when he seemed to strike out just a single time, it was dispersed through both space and time, layering atop one another and making it seem as though he had endless pairs of arms and countless spears. The echoing sounds of their clashes rumbled and layered atop of one another, the bounds of the air war planet threatening to collapse entirely. In the end, this wasn't a true 8th-dimensional world, although Elder Hito had simulated the pressure. It was ultimately just a world of the 7th dimension, and whether it was Lionel or Amory, I think you should take a look at both of them were true sovereigns. Streaks of golden sword and spear force blotted out the rumbling of the clouds. As darkness fell, it felt as though the brightness of the sun was still present among them all. Lionel's Scarlet Star Force constantly fought to erode Amory's Gaia Force. At the same time, Amory's Gaia Force was like an anchor, sinking into Lionel's endless streams of fire and stripping them of their strength. At the same time, Lionel's Emulation Spatial Force forced Amory's Dark Force to continuously manifest itself. Under its strength it was as though it wasn't allowed to be formless and shapeless, grasped by the power of Lionel's control over space. Whether it chose to hide in the shadows or manifested within reality, it would be found nonetheless. Only the ancestors seemed to realize that the battle of this pair of sword and spear sovereigns were occurring both in reality and within the void. The amount of foresight and skill it was taking for the both of them to display this kind of strength wasn't something that should have appeared in the younger generation. Amory's wrist twisted, his dark force sword suddenly losing all form. It wasn't just the force, but rather the blade itself that had vanished. In that moment, it became clear that Amory's sword was actually of the life grade. Lionel's spear missed it, unprepared for this sudden change, and his shoulder was pierced. Despite the sudden change, Lionel didn't seem to react in the slightest. His Scarlet Star force circulated and crushed the dark force that was threatening to enter his body. At the same time, his spear, which had missed its target, didn't pause or stop for even a moment, shredding a path into Amory's shoulder instantly as well. The two drew blood at the same time, retreating a step before exploding forth with an even greater power. At that moment, just as suddenly as the last change, the darkening skies turned entirely black. A surge of universal force descended, basking Amory in an endless light that couldn't be seen by most in the slightest. Day and night were overturned, then reverted once again. It seemed that whichever sword Amory chose to attack with would decide even the state of the world itself. His power jumped explosively, and several cuts were torn into Lionel's armor. Lionel's gaze remained fiery and fierce, his spear changing to a more defensive stance. His spear blade became like a net. Impenetrable by the wind, untouchable by the light. As vast as the skies and sturdy as the earth. His spear force trembled, streams covering him from all sides. Chapter 2092. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:32 and 33 seconds p.m. Chapter 2092, done. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Clang. 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 The rumble of Lionel's poem seemed to resonate with the world, dimming the depth of Amory's night and the brightness of his day. His defenses became airtight, his spearmanship taking another leap forward. The raging battle intent in his eyes seemed to become as calm as a chilly lake, but it was precisely this controlled battle intent that made one's heart grow cold. He took a step to the side, parrying Amory's assault. One spear to connect the earth and skies. Lionel's voice rumbled again and his spear tip met the perfect crossing of Amory's two blades, thrusting through the two of them at precisely the same time and disrupting the flow of his attack. A streak of spear light shot through the vast darkness above, becoming a dividing sign between Amory's natural light realm and the rest of the world. Amory's swords flew to the side and he was forced to take a step back, the strength of Lionel's spearmanship throwing him off balance. But even so, his gaze only gained a fiercer depth to them. His natural light realm changed once again. If before Lionel's, one spear to connect the earth and skies, had been the dividing line, at this moment, Amory himself was the dividing line. It was as though he became the center of the world, his dark force sword holding the night and the Gaia force holding the day. The fierceness of the glow of his innate nodes continued to grow, each becoming the center of their own world. Amory's horn sparked, sharp, howling sword chi spiraling around each one of them. His Gaia force sword rose and the world seemed to fall into silence. The echo of Lionel's poetic words dimmed and faded entirely, the strength of his spear dimming considerably at that moment. To Lionel's astonishment, Amory hadn't actually learned the complete universal force. Universal force was difficult enough to learn normally, but to learn the true version, like Lionel had, and apply universal force to all aspects of his ability, was even more difficult. Lionel didn't believe for a second that Amory didn't have the strength to learn true universal force, or more accurately, the talent. But Amory had made the conscious choice to only learn universal force for his sword force. At first, Lionel didn't understand why this was, but now he had. Amory dedicated his life to the sword in a way that Lionel had never done for the spear, or even the bow. And his universal force reflected exactly that. Boom! Amory's sword streak carried the profundities of the day. The Gaia force swallowed up everything in its path, swallowing up more universal force than Lionel had ever seen in a single instance. He was taking advantage of the strength of his devoted focus toward the sword to manipulate the universal force in a fashion that Lionel had simply never seen before. He traded versatility for complete mastery, and now, this singular strike felt as though it couldn't be blocked. In fact, even as he swung this strike, Lionel felt that Amory was making small changes to his stance even as he moved. He was improving in real time. Lionel suddenly grinned. Facing this tide of sword force that couldn't seem to be blocked, the savageness of his expression only grew, and the pulsing crimson light within the depth of his pale violet irises only grew fiercer and fiercer. "I think you should take a look at the black spear," and Lionel's hand trembled, and Lionel's absolute spear domain suddenly roared to life. However, the moment this cyclone of golden spear force appeared, it began to be corrupted by a deep, black fog. It grew deeper and deeper until the point it had swallowed the entire cyclone, and an enormous sphere of dark force enveloped Lionel and Amory before anyone could react. The strength of Amory's strike fell by half instantly. Lionel roared, piercing out with his spear. He seemed to draw a line through the darkness, but as quickly as he split it into two, was just as quick as it swallowed itself back up, suturing up its own wound. Lionel seemed to have been attacking himself, but Amory's pupils constricted. He felt the dark force innate node within his hand tremble. At that moment, Amory had a shocking thought. Shadow Sovereign. The strength of Amory's dark force sword plunged, and the balance of his natural light realm was thrown off entirely. The strength of universal force comprehension came from the concept of cycles, and cycles found their strength in repetition, balance, and consistency. With one of the cycles being thrown off, the balance plummeted considerably. How could the dark force maintain its proper strength beneath the might of a shadow sovereign? With this spear in hand, and its domain deployed, the strength of Lionel's dark force skyrocketed while Amory's became all but useless. Shadowless. Lionel spoke lightly and without much effort, but his words rumbled through the darkness, echoing into infinity and multiplying over themselves. It sounded as though not just one Lionel had spoken, but a countless number of them. It layered atop his comprehension, resonating and increasing the strength of his spear. At the same time, his gaze glowed with a blinding violet radiance. He had activated Emperor's Edict, fusing its capabilities with his shadow world and increasing its strength to control the world. After speaking such a word, his spear seemed to be both nowhere and everywhere at once. Amory didn't know how to begin to defend because there didn't seem to be anything to defend against. PCHU. The world fell into silence. Even in the darkness, the capabilities of Ancestor Hito were unmatched in this regard. Everyone could see the scene exceptionally clearly. Amory's head had been pierced through. Lionel stood proudly in the skies, his spear blade having split Amory's forehead in two. Their gazes met, and the raging battle intent hadn't faded even in the slightest. Many held their breaths. Even at this moment, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Lionel had truly done it. Chapter 2093. Published at 30th of August 2023, 12:32 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 2093. 333. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Those words that Lionel had spoken seemed to echo in their minds again. It had been too long since he had killed anyone of note, so they had forgotten. But at this moment they were reminded once again. As many as he came across is as many as he would kill. He had spoken those words boldly and beneath the disdain of many. But weeks later, the crowd seemed to have grown stunned to the point of being numbed. He had really done it. Even when Amory, the treasure of the Suyard family, stood before him, he hadn't hesitated to strike to kill for even a single moment. At this moment, the weight of what Lionel's actions really meant were slowly sinking in. However, it was right then that the situation suddenly changed. Amory, who should have been on the final legs of life, suddenly reached up and grabbed Lionel's spear. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he only watched as Amory pulled himself from the tip of his spear, pulling back until the last of the blade was out and blood fell down his face. It was an eerie sight, one that made it look as though countless rivers of blood were dripping down the peaks and crevices of the sword deity. Lionel felt an unprecedented sense of danger that didn't allow him to move. It wasn't that he couldn't move, but he didn't want to move recklessly, feeling that he had been locked onto by something. A single incorrect movement at the wrong time could take his life. When he had learned that Amory was the fiancée of a half-spiritual race woman, he had decided to use this opportunity to attack the latter's forehead. He thought of the possibility that Amory might have also learned a method to separate his soul from his body, allowing him to survive worse wounds than most could imagine. If that was the case, then Amory's most vulnerable point should definitely be his ethereal glabella, so Lionel had struck to shatter it. The wound that was left behind was incomparably smooth and it looked like it had caused minimal damage, but that was only because of Lionel's exquisite control. The reality was that the entire inside of Amory's skull should be nothing but mush at this moment. Amory shouldn't even be able to think, let alone glare at him with battle intent and even move. Lionel's gaze was sharp as he took a glance into Amory's forehead through the small slit that he had created. But as he had expected, there was no ethereal glabella. Even though he had expected this after Amory's unexpected survival, seeing it still left him in some shock. Amory's Gaia force surged and he trembled just once before a large amount of life force from the ground below and water force in the air began to fuel him, quickly healing the wounds on his forehead until it was completely smooth. Even so, it did nothing to change the blood that had already streaked down his face. With his horns and his demonic presence, it truly made him seem to be a devil incarnate. Amory took a breath and exhaled. Indeed, only in a battle of life and death can a person break through. This must be how you improved so quickly. After these air wars are finished, I will leave the human domain. I would be 10 times more powerful than I am now if I didn't have the protection of the Seward family. The hand that Amory had used to grab Lionel's spear trembled once again and his sword surged into it, slapping into his palm with a satisfying echo. With a tremble, his aura changed entirely. The dark and light skies above vanished. As though the atmosphere had been ripped away, for as far as the eye could see, only a vastness of twinkling light could be seen. It felt as though one was standing in an observatory, standing in the middle of a dome of starry lights that grasped the soul. Stars streaked across this canopy, howling with an intent of the sword. From time to time, these streaking stars would flash again, each time exhibiting another facet of a sword's beauty. It felt vast and endless. Lionel was certain. Amory's universal force had broken through, leaving behind the natural light realm to enter the cosmos realm. It was well known that the universal forces were the only method through which those of lower dimensions could battle those above them. Of course, the likes of Lionel and Aina had proven this to be untrue, as overwhelming talent and comprehension of force manipulation could do the same. The Four Seasons realm allowed those of the fourth dimension to battle those of the fifth. The natural light realm allowed those of the sixth dimension to battle those of the seventh. And the cosmos realm allowed those of the seventh dimension to battle those of the eighth. I think you should take a look at suddenly, the gap between Lionel and Amory had become insurmountable. It was as exaggerated as the difference of night and day that had just been displayed. Even so, Lionel suddenly chuckled. His unmoving body suddenly relaxed. So is that what it was? Interesting. SHU. Lionel swiped his spear across the air twice in quick succession, leaving behind a howling and sharp wind. With a flicker, his armor shone and the silver-gold lights took a more prominent role. At that moment, just a single clone was formed, splitting off from Lionel's body. Amory's gaze suddenly narrowed. He actually couldn't tell even after a second glance which was the clone and which of them was real. What made it even more difficult to accept was the fact that the clone, or at least the one that wasn't holding a spear currently, flipped his palm to reveal a bow he recognized all too well. The White Lion Bow. The body of the clone trembled, a heart-shuddering aura taking shape as he vanished, appearing high in the skies and pulling back his bowstring. That's fine. Since one of me isn't enough, two will be. Lionel's stance shifted, his back leg gliding back in an elegant arc. The forces of the world fell into silence. I'll give you some advice, Lionel said lightly. You have exactly 333 exchanges to kill me. Lionel's clone's bowstring reached a full moon. Amory's heart skipped a beat, a shocking pressure suddenly descending and causing his gaze to narrow. He couldn't believe that this sort of pressure was coming from Lionel. Could it be that even until this point, Lionel was still holding back? He found it difficult to believe. The forces around Lionel began to shimmer with a soft light, small and delicate lines of wavy fog emitting from his body. The arc that his back foot had drawn took form, shaping the first line in a mysterious force art. At the same time, the same thing occurred to his clone high in the skies. A second piece of advice, Lionel grinned. You had better kill the both of us within that time frame. Lionel's spear shuddered and he suddenly moved. All the world could seem to focus on was the fluttering blade of his spear. Chapter 2094. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 26 seconds p.m. Chapter 2094. Bleeding if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's aura flourished, the accumulation of force in the surroundings surging toward him in violent tides. It felt as though the entire world was in the palm of his hands, forces of all kinds being stripped of their character and uniqueness to fuel the strength of his spear force. Amory's gaze narrowed once. 300 attacks? Wasn't that just child's play? He took a step forward, his sword light descending before it seemed that he had moved at all. It felt like his sword had a mind of its own, almost as though it wasn't just an extension of his arm, but its own living, breathing existence. The rippling of the stars above reacted to Amory's movements, descending toward Lionel with a menacing light. Lionel's gaze turned sharp, an unprecedented seriousness taking hold of him. At that moment, his gaze lost its fierceness entirely, being replaced by a gaze that seemed to see through the world. It was indifferent to its very depths and vast by its very nature. Looking into his eyes, it felt less like one was gazing upon a youth, and more like they were observing a being that was larger than life, an existence that was larger than even the world he claimed to exist within. His spear moved to meet Amory's attacks. It seemed to lose its splendor, returning to an absolute simplicity. It felt like the turning pages of a book, a casual sip of water, even as rudimentary as a careless breath of air. It was the kind of movement that carried an endless ease, and yet the fundamental importance was beyond imagining, as though it was part of a bigger picture that couldn't be pinned down with any immediacy. Lionel took a step back, and then another. A line of blood appeared across his shoulder, then by his cheek. In the next instant blood sprayed from his neck in a fierce rain, but the cold indifference in his eyes was just as placid as it had been from the very beginning. There was no doubt that the gap between himself and Amory had suddenly exploded. It was so enormous in fact that retreating was all that he could seem to do. Whether it was himself or the clone in the skies, they moved as one, taking steps back at the same moment. Lionel's stance shifted and his spear pierced forward. He seemed to have sensed a change in Amory's thought process before even the man in question had decided upon it. He disrupted the attack entirely, but in return his collarbone was pierced through. A flare of scarlet star force suddenly shot out from the blade wound, rushing after Amory's dark force blade. Amory hadn't been prepared for such an unconventional attack, but he reacted as quickly as one might expect. The stars in the skies shifted and his dark force blade solidified once again. His wrist turned and he twisted through the surging flames. He could feel the overwhelming power of destruction bearing down on him, but his Gaia force reacted soon after, stopping the destruction with large amounts of life force before it could interfere with his body. At this moment, the weakness of having chosen to focus on sword universal force alone was showing. While his sword techniques were exceptionally powerful, and he had even broken through to the cosmos realm so quickly after entering the seventh dimension, this advancement was only useful in his sword techniques. However, this was still more than he felt Lionel should be able to handle. Amory shrugged off the attack, his movements becoming fluid once again, or more accurately, they had never lost their fluidity. At this moment, the battle between Lionel and Amory had begun to cause far less destruction than it had in the past. Whereas before the grounds collapsed and the clouds above were stirred, the current moment it was as though the entire world had had a dampener placed upon it. I think you should take a look at sounds weren't as loud, clashes weren't as resounding, even the crossing of their weapons made it seem as though they were a pair of third-dimensional existents attacking one another fiercely instead of the geniuses they truly were. But as time passed, the devastation of such a battle became more and more apparent. Clouds of blood continuously erupted from Lionel's body, his lips leaking and his limbs threatening to hang limply by his side. Amory seemed to become more accustomed to his new strength with every swing of the blade. He was all too aware of the complex force art forming beneath the feet of both himself and Lionel, and the count of the number of spear strikes, while continuously increasing in his mind, still didn't make him panic in the slightest. The confidence he had in his swords was unlike anything else. Even if Lionel managed to last 333 exchanges, so what? He would sever this attack with his blade just like he had everything else. Lionel's stance suddenly shifted. His stiff and direct movements gained a sudden grace to them. His spear swept through the air, leaving an alluring draw of sparking, silvery fog. The incomplete force art beneath him pulsed and then pulsed again. His attacks became fiercer, but the number of lines of blood appearing across his body increased. The cracks in his armor began to accumulate and it threatened to lose its function entirely. However, at that moment, one of Lionel's tails trembled. His lotus domain took shape and the world suddenly became a blinding ball of golden light. For as far as the eye could see, not a single drop of dark force could be sensed. One of Amory's swords lost their most powerful reliance. His dark force seemed to be stripped from him, only capable of circulating within his body, but completely unable to make an appearance into the real world. The only oddity in the world were two force arts of shimmering violet light. Shadowless. Lionel's deep voice echoed once again. Chapter 2095. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 24 seconds p.m. Chapter 2095. 332 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Amory's pupils constricted. This attack was one that he hadn't been able to sense the first time, but almost as soon as his heart skipped a beat, he regained his composure. His sword seemed to improve once again. Clang! He struck out without even looking, his blade parrying Lionel's strike. Lionel's spear faltered and his force art flickered, threatening to collapse. The greatest weakness of his spear dance technique was that every stroke had to be perfect. If he made even a single mistake, he would need to start again from the beginning. This was only the second time he had used such a technique, and it was even in a completely different situation than the first time, but Amory had actually reacted to it even quicker than he had the first time. Not only had he reacted faster, but he had not just blocked, but even parried it. A sword blade entered Lionel's chest, just barely missing his heart but still tearing a hole right through his lungs. Before the sword force could explode, Lionel's cold, indifferent gaze flickered with a slight violet light. He activated Emperor's Edict, fusing it with his mother's bubble world technique. He had long since realized that these two techniques had the very same foundation. He contained Amory's sword strike, and in an odd occurrence, the blade separated into two pieces almost as though the front of Lionel's body had become a portal to his back, but leaving his body itself entirely unscathed. The explosion of Amory's sword force occurred to Lionel's back, a strong spatial force warping its location. Lionel's spear recovered quickly, his eyes flickering with a calculative light as he adjusted and made up for the mistake. His body spun out of the way, his spear arching backward, sweeping down and then up once again, forming a gorgeous semicircle of golden spear force that ascended right toward Amory's head. Lionel's spear tip and Amory's sword tip met perfectly. Lionel was forced into a strong retreat, but his spear seemed to use the momentum of Amory's retaliation to draw another elegant arc through the air. Amory's gaze narrowed. He could feel the pressure of Lionel's spear strikes increasing. It had already been over 200 exchanges, and though Lionel was in a sorry state, Amory could feel that the accumulating power in his spear was only increasing. Lionel himself felt that his understanding of Amory was quickly deepening. The two had both stopped using their ability indexes at once, and they had once again both started using them again at the same time. He was certain. Amory's ability index was very much similar to Ana's, however it wasn't related to self-healing or blood sovereignty. Instead, he seemed capable of improving extremely quickly. It hadn't been obvious before because he had been at the bottleneck of the natural light realm, but the moment he crossed into the cosmos realm and gained so much room to improve, it was as though he was riding with jet fuel in his sword. Every time Lionel's spear dance improved, so too did Amory's, and in what was an absolutely shocking realization, it felt that Amory was improving even faster than his spear dance could. Even so, a realization was just a realization. The clash of their spear and sword didn't move Lionel in the slightest. In fact, his heartbeat became calmer. The lines that his spear drew across the air became firmer and less impacted by Amory's swords. His steps became lighter, his hands moving faster and the weight of his strikes heavier. I think you should take a look at bang. 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 Suddenly, the space between the two erupted. The silence of their clashes seemed to have boiled over. The planet rumbled, pits of carnage forming everywhere they went, but this time they were so deep that bubbling pools of magma rushed over their edges, snaking across the crevices of the ground and burning everything in their path. The fierce glow of Lionel's gaze seemed to have reached its fever pitch. Blood leaked from every inch of his body. It seemed that there wasn't a single location on him that didn't contain an injury, but every ounce of force in his body seemed to have been focused on just this singular pursuit. The twisting of Lionel's feet, the sway of his spear, the trembling tip of his blade, it seemed to fuse with the image of a dance that the spectators had seen all those weeks ago. At that moment, the backdrop of Lionel's 10 stars seemed to become a cosmos of their own. They separated, taking up points of Lionel's quickly forming force art as though they were anchors. Lines of force surged out of them. Dream Force. Scarlet Star Force. Void Force. Vital Star Force. Within the shimmering ball of gold, they were the only other sources of light. Standing in the middle of it all, one force art below, and the other above, rotating like the complex inner workings of an ancient clock, Lionel's wrist stiffened as he took a single step forward. With this step, the world around his soul rippled. It felt like the very fabric of the world itself was moving like the disturbed surface of a lake. The sudden rush of danger hit Amory like a moving truck. The accumulation of Lionel's power had been so slow and incremental until this moment when it exploded forth like a geyser from the heart of Mother Earth. His hair fluttered in the winds. At that moment, wrapped in colors of royal blue, gold, vibrant violet, deep blacks and hues of silver, Lionel looked to be no different from a guardian deity, unmatched and untouchable. That danger that the eighth-dimensional ancestors had felt before assaulted their senses once again. 332, Lionel said lightly. The violet glow in his eyes had grown to the point that the whites of his eyes couldn't be seen any longer. As though 2 orbs of amethyst had replaced his eyes, he looked down upon the world, unmatched and untouchable. Then, he pierced forward. Chapter 2096. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 2096, Lost? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Amory's expression became dignified, his heart turning as cold as steel. He took a deep breath and then exhaled slowly. He couldn't see anything in this world of gold, but he didn't need to. His cosmos had become his eyes, his sword his heart, there was nothing that they couldn't be guided to. In this state of tranquility, Amory seemed to break through once again. His sword swayed to his sides, pointing at the ground at an angle. His chest was entirely open to attack, but his breath was unhurried. Suddenly, when Lionel's spear strike was upon him, his eyes flashed open, a blinding light of radiance coming from them. Meeting Lionel's amethyst, pearly-like eyes, one of his became a dense black pearl and the other a magenta one. He looked toward the world with this sort of dichotomy, a silence of the ages falling. And then, there was a howl. His sword seemed to come to life, his sword domain ring shaking fiercely. He drew 2 circles with his swords and then suddenly pierced forward. The entire human domain held their breaths. It was only just a few fractions of a second, these fractions felt like an eternity. They seemed to feel the weight of this battle. It wasn't just about choosing a winner, it was about choosing the future leader of the human domain. None of the other youths they had seen could compare to these two in terms of talent and future potential. No matter how good one's crafting was. Strength reigned supreme. Boom! Lionel and Amory shot backward, their speeds faster than anything they had displayed until this point, and it was precisely because of the power of their strikes. They both spit out a mouthful of blood, but compared to Amory, Lionel's state had already been absolutely terrible. He couldn't afford such an injury at this moment, he had already been hanging on by a thread to begin with. Lionel landed on the ground heavily for the first time in the battle, but he pierced his spear into the ground, drawing a deep trench through the ground until he came to a stop. He heaved for breath, blood hacking up from time to time. That was indeed the strongest strike he was capable of in this state. That was a spear strike that touched upon the fourth layer, although it was in the sixth dimension, that wasn't something that most in the human domain could fathom. He was certain. If an ancestor wasn't prepared for this strike, he could definitely severely injure them with this strike. For context, for most even Tier 9 7th dimensional existences, even if a Tier 1 ancestor stood still and allowed you to attack them for days on end, you would be lucky to leave even a single mark on their skin. The higher one's dimension, the larger the gaps. But Lionel hadn't expected for Amory to actually touch upon the third layer of 7th dimensional sword force in that final moment. That man was truly a genius, even in such a perilous situation, he was able to make such progress. Lionel coughed up another mouthful of blood, shaking his head. Amory's Gaia force was truly powerful. His Scarlet Star force was having a hard time dealing with it properly. It couldn't be helped. Amory had had his innate node for over 30 years. Lionel had only had his in his possession for less than 4 years total, and even then it was mutated and didn't allow him to take proper control of it. He was ironically making faster progress with his emulation spatial force now only because it was actually normal. He slowly stood to his feet, suppressing Amory's Gaia force and not allowing it to rampage about. In the distance, about 100 meters away, a meaningless distance to them, Lionel could see Amory standing to his feet. Amory had a trickle of blood falling down his lips, and his face was pale, but other than that, he seemed to be perfectly fine. The human domain seemed to collectively release a sigh. Indeed, it seemed that it was quite obvious who had come out on top this time. Amory might have been slightly injured and a little weak, but other than being tired, there wasn't much else wrong with him. The winner was clear. The Seared family exhaled a breath of air they hadn't known they had been holding. They had never expected for a sixth-dimensional existence to push Amory to this point. They couldn't help but shudder. That was right, Lionel wasn't in the 7th dimension yet. I think you should take a look at Amory took deep breaths and eventually regulated his breathing. His Gaia force trembled and large amounts of life force seemed to connect directly to him. Ironically, now that he was on land, the effect of his Gaia force was even more prominent and powerful. His recovery speed was at least 10 times what it had been in the air, and the paleness of his face was quickly recovering. It seems that my ring will be staying with me today, Amory said lightly. If you don't want to die, I would suggest breaking your badge now. Though, if you cower in this way, it's like you won't ever be my opponent again. Amory didn't talk often. There were only two kinds of people that he spared words on, people he felt deserved it, and people that he truly looked down upon. Ironically, Lionel had been on both sides of his opinion. In the Dimensional Cleanse trial zone, he had spoken harsh words toward Lionel because he had truly felt that he was too pathetic. And now, he was speaking to Lionel like he would an equal. As for sparing Lionel, he never really considered it. That was because he felt that although Lionel was still in the 6th dimension, so long as he continued to improve, he would never be able to catch up even if he let him leave. Plus, if someone was spared like this, the genius they had once been would be gone. There was no use in saving a crippled genius who no longer held any sort of self-belief. However, who would have expected for Lionel to chuckle at that moment? Amory wasn't very surprised. If Lionel cowered at this moment, he wouldn't have been a person he acknowledged in the first place. But what did surprise him were Lionel's actual words. "I think you're forgetting something," Lionel said lightly. Amory recalled instantly. He wasn't a fool, he had been paying attention to the second Lionel all this time, but somewhere around the 200th attack, it had lost its aura entirely. Wait, wasn't that the moment that Lionel had suddenly deployed that odd world of gold? Amory's pupils constricted and the world was enveloped by a galaxy-warping aura descended. Lionel smiled. Despite being bloodied and beaten, he was incomparably relaxed. He shook his spear and that aura that had vanished seemed to double. "You see, I can send out that spear strike twice. As for the arrow that's about to descend, well, let's just say it's easily 10 times more powerful than both." How could it not be? Although Lionel's spear dance was more flexible and allowed him to use it in battle while maintaining his movement, what it couldn't do was accumulate it all into a single strike. Lionel suddenly stepped forward and pierced out a second spear strike. Amory's hair stood on end. He had yet to accumulate enough himself to parry, although he was recovering quickly, it wasn't quickly enough. He couldn't even deal with this second spear strike. How would he handle the arrow that was coming? He had actually lost. Chapter 2097. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 22 p.m. Chapter 2097. I was wondering. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The arrow streaked across the skies as though it could split reality in two. Despite the fact an attack, devastating in its own right, was coming from Lionel's spear didn't seem to change anything at all, because all one could seem to focus on was that spiraling arrow. The world was divided into four, the split prongs of the arrow rotating and leaving complete wave-like patterns across the ground and within the clouds above. Everything in its path was shredded apart, and when it had only made it halfway to its destination, Lionel's spear suddenly met Amory's swords. That pair of life-grade swords shuddered, their bodies losing a great amount of shine as their owner was sent flying backward, digging a deep trench into the ground that embedded him like an etching upon a stone wall. Amory couldn't move. His body was shaking involuntarily, his hands barely strong enough to hold onto his swords. He looked up into the skies, only having time to complete that action alone before Lionel's arrow appeared before him, shooting through his chest and releasing an explosion that echoed throughout the land. The sound was so loud that nothing else could be heard. It was difficult to tell even when it had stopped, the sharp whistling sound of deafness and damaged hearing being all that most could listen to. Even when they covered their ears, trying to escape from the destruction, it followed them, filling their minds with sensory information they would never be able to forget. Lionel breathed out, his chest heaving. He looked into the skies, his eyes closing. Despite his injuries, he stood tall. The loud noises didn't seem to bother him in the slightest, and the rumbling ground beneath his feet couldn't stop him from standing tall and unbothered. As the sounds died down, a smile curled his lips. Nothing could seem to bother him at the moment. He was truly a man who held grudges. He had already defeated Amory once before, but he was still irritated by that matter in the dimensional cleanse zone. After a moment, he wondered. If he claimed Amory's soul now, would he be able to use the latter to comprehend the later stages of dimensional cleanse, and finally break into the seventh dimension? It was hard to tell. That was because dimensional cleanse had an odd sort of protection over it. Even those that had learned the parts beyond the third dimension couldn't share it with others. Only Lionel could because he had fully comprehended and reverse-engineered the method. He had succeeded in doing so for the fourth, fifth, and sixth dimensional layers, but he had yet to even lay eyes on the seventh dimensional method, so it was hard to tell where to go from here. Theoretically, he could deduce that on his own since he had the foundation, but without personal experience of what it was like to be in the seventh dimension, or deep understanding of where he would need to proceed to enter the eighth and ninth dimension beyond, such a deduction would be nigh impossible. More accurately, he could do it, but what he deduced wouldn't necessarily be the correct next step. It could still deviate in all sorts of ways and it would be too hard to tell if he was correct or not. His father might be able to give him some clues, but Lionel would rather roll over dead than ask that old man questions face to face. He could imagine the scorn already. I think you should take a look at Forget It. It's easier to just find another token to enter the Dimensional Cleanse trial zone. If others could hear Lionel's thoughts, they would definitely roll their eyes. Were these a pair of father and son? Or mortal enemies? It was impossible to tell. Lionel slowly opened his eyes and he looked down to see that Amory was still stuck, embedded into the side of a deep trench his own body had dug out. There was a small hole in his chest, barely 2 inches across, but that was what made Lionel's attack so devastating. It had caused such destruction in the real world, but at the point of contact, it was actually so perfectly controlled. It was hard to imagine that an existence of the 6th dimension could possibly display such might. Amory might look like he had only suffered a small wound, but setting aside where the attack had landed, even if it had only hit his arm, the entirety of his inner organs were shredded to pieces. Whether it was heart, lungs, nervous system, everything. Lionel's strike was so skillful that all of the residual energy that might have laid waste to the world around them had he allowed it to rampage was concentrated to the point that the one that had suffered the most was Amory himself. It was a shocking endeavor, and yet, Amory actually still seemed to be alive. Seeing this, Lionel chuckled, walking forward. This sort of vitality was something that he had only seen out of demons. Back when he fought the Cobra demon, he had ripped a hole right through its torso and even caused a large amount of damage to its inner organs, and yet it had continued to battle him and even pushed him to the very edge. Although Amory looked like a demon, it wasn't that simple to tie the two. Rather, Lionel instead believed that it was a combination of Amory's Gaia Force innate node and his separated soul that led to this matter. But that left a question: if Amory's ethereal glabella wasn't in his head, and it wasn't in his chest, then where was it, exactly? Lionel took a seat at the edge of the trench Amory's body had formed. At the moment, Amory's gaze was vacant, but his body was actually quickly recovering. His vitality was actually far stronger than even Lionel's own, but Lionel's smile didn't fade. I was wondering why it was that you all allowed me to attack him just like that, but it seemed that you were quite confident in his ability to survive, huh? Chapter 2098. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 2098. Interesting. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't seem to be talking to anyone. Whether it was the other members of the Seward family, their subordinate families, or even Lionel's own subordinates, they had all evacuated from the region long ago. The entire city that had once been here had been destroyed under the might of their battle. There truly didn't seem to be anyone to talk to. To most of the human domain that were observing the situation, Amory was already dead. That vacant look in his eye, that sort of wound, there was simply no surviving it. Many couldn't help but think that maybe a few of Lionel's screws had been knocked loose during the battle. But to the astonishment of those present, Lionel continued to speak despite not receiving an answer. There really is no need to hide anymore. Look at how weak and vulnerable I am, aren't I on the chopping block for your viewing pleasure? Isn't it best if you took action right here and now? You can't want to lose this opportunity, no? Lionel grinned. His feet swung as though he was seated on a swing. He looked happy despite his injuries and he didn't seem to take his defeat of Amory with any hint of pride at all, almost as though it was only natural that this would happen. But suddenly, his demeanor changed entirely as he looked toward a certain direction, his gaze as fiery as a blaze of light. His eyes seemed to emit a great amount of strength as a plume of fire descended upon a certain region. These flames danced with hidden great runes, complex and ancient. They were entirely different than the flames Lionel had used on Amory, but it was hard to tell if it was because he had been holding back or if there was another reason. In reality, Gaia Force was something Lionel felt had been an even greater antithesis to his Scarlet Star Force than even Void Star Force would have been in the hands of someone powerful. In many works of fiction or amusing tales, Water Force would be the perfect counter to Fire Force, but the truth was that this was a matter of relativity. There were numerous types of Water Force that wouldn't even be able to approach Lionel without being burnt to ash. What mattered wasn't the element, but also its quality and quantity. Beyond that, Water Force wasn't the only thing good at suppressing Fire Force, because there was Earth Force as well. Earth Force was sturdy and great defensively, it was resistant against being destroyed and hard to light on fire. Gaia Force carried both the sturdiness and resilience of Earth and also had the suppressive effects of powerful water on his Scarlet Star Force. Then, to top it all off, it had a strong life force associated with it, the strongest counter there was against the powers of destruction and a destruction sovereign. Against Amory, the improvements to his Scarlet Star Force couldn't be displayed properly, while it would have been foolish to use Void Star Force actively since whether it was water or dark force, Amory was his superior. Now that he wasn't facing Amory who countered him so perfectly, the strength of his Scarlet Star Force flourished in its truest light. However, before it could descend on its target location, a shadow shifted out of the way, quickly forming. Very quickly a beautiful young lady took shape, but even then they were difficult to see properly. Their face was obscured and the only thing that could be vaguely understood was the fiery nature of her body, too fiery, even, for casual eyes to see. Her figure could only be described as perfect. Although her skin was a little gray, something that could be seen even through the haze, it didn't make her look sickly at all, and instead showed a hint of a unique character to it. I think you should take a look at her hips were wide, rounding to form a pair of long, luscious legs. They made way for a butt so round and plump that it could be seen both from the sides of her waist and through the gap in her thighs. Her chest carried just as much volume, threatening to burst against the pressure of its own skin as though even it couldn't accommodate it all. And yet, despite the fiery nature of this woman's figure, she chose maybe the most dangerous kind of clothing to cover it with. Her chest was bound by nothing more than a nipple pasties, a black, metallic, circular object that was connected to nothing other than her breasts. Although there were chains of black around her shoulders and collarbone, they seemed to be there for nothing more than decoration because they hardly covered anything, leaving very little to the imagination. Her bottom half was hardly any better. The thong she wore was entirely strapless. The part of it that covered her front was shaped like a black metallic leaf, while the back of it was entirely swallowed by those two round cheeks. This sort of clothing was definitely something that should appear in one's private bedroom and not out for so many to see, even if it was somewhat obstructed by a haze, but this woman clearly didn't care in the slightest. Interesting, Lionel thought. She has the same ability index as Arthur, but for dark force instead. Rare, very rare. Arthur is the only one I've seen with an ability index that allows their entire body to turn into an element, and she's the second. Lionel was unmoved by the sight before him. She might as well have been a piece of meat on a butcher's table. Instead, when he spoke, he didn't seem to be satisfied with this alone. Instead, his eyes shifted and landed on another location. This time, the existence that was hidden moved even before Lionel's fire manifested. This time, the individual was quite clear to the eye. A shadow sovereign, Lionel smiled. This individual was none other than Zavnik, Third Nova. Lionel wasn't very surprised by this in the slightest, even when he felt that Zavnik had fully recovered. Chapter 2099. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 2099, Plop. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Zavnik had already regained his calm. When he looked at Lionel, his emotions were unreadable. In truth, he hadn't expected for Lionel to actually win such a battle. Amory was arrogant, but he had the right to be. He was the reason why, despite the fact that the Morales had so many heirs in this generation, no one had spoken of the Seward family's decline. He alone, with his sword, was enough to uphold the skies for them. He was an existence seen to be on the same level as Velasco. He was only over 25 years old, but he had already reached Tier 2 of the 7th dimension, and very soon he would enter Tier 3. He was an existence the likes of which very few could match up to already, and that was proven by him comprehending the cosmos realm. It had to be remembered that not everyone returned at the same time. Depending on their distance from Lionel when the formation had been activated, one could either return sooner or later during that 20-year span, and most had returned around 10 to 12 years ago. Amory, however, had only returned about 5 or so years ago. It went to show one just the kind of talent he had to reach such a state so quickly. After he returned from the tribulation, it was as though he had become an entirely different man. But it had all been useless before Lionel. Amory was born and raised seriously by the Suyard family from the moment he picked up a sword. Lionel had only returned to the Morales family a month ago. Amory had been training since he was a toddler. Lionel only began when he was 17 years old, and even then he had no sort of guidance aside from a silver disc and the memories of the experts in the spear domain ring, experts that Amory had access to on his own side. On top of that already 17-year advantage, Amory gained 5 more years of advantage thanks to the Cataclysm Zone. The gap between them was obvious, and it was a shocking thing to accept. But what stunned Zavnik even more was maybe the implication of Lionel's words. What had he meant by those words? They didn't save Amory because they knew he could survive? By him saying that, didn't that mean? Zavnik's gaze turned serious. What? Not going to admit it? Lionel laughed. He had expected this. In order for Lionel to know the relationship between Zavnik and Amory, it would mean that he understood things he very much shouldn't have, like Zavnik's goals, who he was working for, what underbelly lay in the Morales family and when it might spring up upon them. But all of that was impossible. Lionel wasn't Second Nova, and even Second Nova couldn't claim to know so much. Lionel's laughter made Zavnik uneasy, and all the progress he had made to take the shadow of Lionel out from his heart and soul seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. When Lionel finished his next words, the viciousness that flashed in Zavnik's gaze couldn't be ignored. Are you shocked? You shouldn't be, Lionel smiled. You see, I'm very good at using small details to comprehend the bigger picture. Unfortunately, this partner of yours has very loose lips. You know, the first time I met him, it was just about 3 years ago. Well, it was 3 years ago to me. To all of you, it was probably closer to 30 years than it is to 3 by a wide margin. This guy was very arrogant back then. Poor little me was just in tier 1 of the 5th dimension, but he had already broken through into the 6th. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to avoid him because we were both seeking the complete layers of dimensional cleanse, and I had no choice but to battle it out with me. I was defeated, quite soundly, but this guy actually tried to take my spear domain ring. And do you know what he said back then? Lionel turned from Amory and looked to meet Zavnik's eyes. Zavnik felt as though his world was collapsing. He couldn't breathe properly. It felt like a hand was gripped around his throat. He said he knew someone would be far better suited to the spear domain ring than me. Can you believe that? What an arrogant bastard, right? He doesn't even use the spear, and look at how antisocial he is. Even his family had to arrange a marriage for him just so that he could have a wife. Where would he find someone he would give the spear domain ring to? Let alone someone that he trusted and respected enough to do so. I think you should take a look at Zavnik's hands were trembling. It wasn't about the revelation itself was almost meaningless aside from the implication that Lionel knew everything. But what was setting Zavnik's heart ablaze was the fact that Lionel had figured so much out based on a single casual sentence spoken years ago to him in the spur of the moment. There was practically no one who could do such a thing. Such a memory was the kind most would only remember after they found out the truth, and only then would they backtrack and realize the clues had been there all along. But Lionel's mind seemed to be on an entirely different level. Those clues that were meaningless crumbs to most people's minds became a masterful tale in his own, weaving a story that was 99% close to the truth without much effort at all. Rho alpha n d alpha s n omicron v epsilon l. C omicron m, and now facing the weight of those words, Zavnik felt like he couldn't breathe. Lionel couldn't even be bothered to explain things to his own family, but he had spent so much care laying things out for Zavnik. It was clear that this was the scene he wanted to see. He could practically watch the reflection of Zavnik's world collapsing through his gaze. Lionel found it very amusing. Somehow, he felt that this was even more satisfying than punching the face of someone he hated. Seeing that things were going wrong again, and remembering what had happened last time Zavnik had lost his reason, the scantily clad woman suddenly spoke. She was very disappointed in Zavnik. The Zavnik she knew was a king amongst men, and he had always taken his steps so calmly and assuredly. Until he met Lionel. This Lionel had to die, only that way could their anchor in the Morales family be solid. So, she said the most sinister thing she could think of. You speak a lot for someone who won't be living for much longer. Amory will not die and will recover quite quickly, and you don't have the strength to land the finishing blow, especially not with us here. Whether it's myself or Zavnik, we are both stronger than Amory. And very soon, Amory's fiancée will come, and she's no weaker than him. What chance do you stand? Lionel blinked. The pause in his words seemed to give the scantily clad woman a sense of satisfaction, until... plop. A head suddenly descended from the skies, landing and rolling until it hit paused by her feet. Bang! A Valkyrie descended from the skies, her black wings blotting out the skies as she landed by Lionel's side heavily. The scantily clad woman's eyes opened wide. She looked down at the head at her feet, a head too gorgeous to put into words, and yet, it had no body attached to it. She recognized this head immediately. The heiress of the spiritual's religion. The shriek of a banshee echoed through the battlefield, the violently whirling tornado of black feathers around Aina seemingly wanting more blood. Chapter 2100. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 2100. Unwilling if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Aina's aura blazed like the spark of an awakening star. Although she didn't say anything, her presence alone seemed to warp the world around them, the arcs of black lightning that sparked between her horns and the black feathers that zipped by causing even the eyes of those that only gazed upon them to sting. Her black wings came out from the back of her hips, but their majestic bearing was no less. Each spread out for at least 2 meters, carefully arcing through the air with the grace of a phoenix. Just a single one of their flaps made the Shadow Woman and Zavnik feel as though they might be thrown off their feet, their bodies flexing just to maintain their positions. The eyes of the scantily clad woman froze over. She couldn't take her eyes off of Aina, her heart palpitating at the aura she was sensing. What she felt the proper conclusion was happened to be something that she was entirely unwilling to accept. She had all the information she needed about these matters. It was simply impossible for Aina to be what she thought. Aina was a Brazinger, she was born on Earth, her mother was a mortal woman and her father, though an unknown wild card, was ultimately just a cast out of the Brazinger family. It didn't make any sense for her to have this kind of aura, but then it all suddenly clicked. Blood Sovereign. She said lightly. It was true. Back then, when their cohort was sent to the Rapak's nest, the true goal wasn't Lionel or dealing with him, nor was it for Amory to receive the egg of the future ruler of the Rapaks. No, from the very beginning, the goal had been Aina. Lionel had been infuriated back then when the variant invalids appeared and simply directly killed them in his tirade, so it had been impossible to confirm this. The only one outside of the individuals related to the Three-Finger Cult who knew this with absolute certainty was Lionel's father. But just the same way Lionel hardly explained things to others, neither did his father explain things to him. Although Lionel had partially deduced this matter, there was still a limit to what he could do even with his intelligence when information was so limited, especially when there were so many other answers that likewise made sense. It also didn't help that the answers simply didn't seem all that important. Ever since they reunited, Aina had always been by his side or within range of a region he could act in. It didn't matter to him if the Three-Finger Cult were targeting her, because whoever came would simply have to face his wrath. In addition to that, since that moment, the Three-Finger Cult seemed to have forgotten about Aina, having not chosen to make any other moves. It was hard to tell how valuable they saw Aina to be, or if they were aware that kidnapping her wouldn't suddenly make her come over to their side. The truth of this matter, though, was something that the Shadow Woman was well aware of. It wasn't that the Three-Finger Cult had forgotten about Aina, it was rather that someone had been born within their ranks that was far easier to make use of and just as valuable to them as a blood sovereign. Plus, after their first failure, the deployment of the Cataclysm Zone had caused them to believe Aina was dead and dealt with. Until she suddenly appeared once more years later. That was right, the Cataclysm Zone had been a scheme by the Three-Finger Cult to deal with the greatest threats of the human domain in one fell swoop. Not only would some of the most powerful experts be lost in a far-off land, but the future generations would have all been crushed in a single action. I think you should take a look at Rho Alpha and D Alpha S Nu Omicron V Epsilon L Omicron M. Lionel had thought that this matter could have only been done by them, but he still didn't have an answer for why. What did they gain out of it? If the Three-Finger Cult knew that the Cataclysm Zone was the real world, wouldn't they know that sending them all there wouldn't accomplish anything? Even if they never managed to come back, wouldn't they just be able to live out normal lives in the real world? Of course, that was a matter of relativity. Everyone stuck in that zone would want to come back to something familiar, especially since they weren't aware of what the Dream Project was or what it represented. That meant that the more important question to ask wasn't this, but rather what in his simulation world was so valuable that the Three-Finger Cult would choose to continuously target it? Something wasn't quite adding up. Lionel didn't believe that the Three-Finger Cult would be able to access that world and yet be unaware of the simulation. In fact, he had already deduced that their three leaders had to have been from the Cataclysm Zone to begin with, so they most definitely knew. So why? He didn't have an answer, and his confusion wasn't something that this shadow woman would clear up, at least not willingly, and that was assuming that a lower-level character like her would even be aware of this matter to begin with. Instead, it was the shadow woman who was glancing at Aina with an enlightened expression, finally fusing the rumors she had heard with the woman before her. She sent a glance toward Zavnik and spoke. "She's the Blood Sovereign." Zavnik's pupils constricted before his gaze became somewhat malevolent. He seemed fully prepared to erupt with his greatest strength now. However, Lionel was still sitting, unmoving. His ease despite the situation made him feel suffocated. That smile, whenever he saw that smile, he knew that bad things would happen. "Get up." Zavnik pointed toward Lionel, almost as though trying to command him to do something that made him feel more at ease. However, Lionel only chuckled. Chapter 2101. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 13 seconds p.m. Chapter 2101. Clear aura. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Me? Get up. Can't you see how tired I am? I don't have the energy. Lionel suddenly yawned, his eyes even watering to complete the effect. He really seemed as though he might collapse and begin a long, comfortable napping session at any moment now. Veins bulged across Zavnik's forehead. His composure was entirely thrown into the wind. Those who had had great opinions of him in the past couldn't help but begin to second-guess their judgment. Was this really the Zavnik they had come to know? Lionel was right before him. Why wasn't he attacking? Although it could be argued that Lionel was still sitting and it wasn't honorable to attack, it also wasn't honorable to lurk in the shadows and wait for their battle to finish first. If Zavnik really cared about being honorable, rather than trying to force Lionel to get up right now, he would instead allow him to rest. But it was clear and obvious that Zavnik didn't dare to do that. He wasn't trying to be honorable, he was scared of Lionel's nonchalance, scared of what trump card Lionel might have waiting for him in the shadows. To Zavnik, the fact that Lionel dared to continue to sit down and be so casual meant that he had another plot waiting to be sprung. The moment he took action, he would fall into it. He didn't believe in himself anymore and he was entirely reliant on Lionel's actions to dictate his own. The more relaxed Lionel was, the more uncomfortable he felt. The more Lionel acted like this, the more he felt that he was missing something. Svel. See Omicron M. It had to be remembered that when Lionel defeated him earlier, it wasn't even Lionel who took action, it was rather the formation of the Sky's family. That was a formation of 10,000 seventh-dimensional individuals, fused into one and amplified further. Zavnik could easily defeat 10,000 average seventh-dimensional existences on a normal day. Well, easily was an exaggeration, but he was sure that he could do it. The problem with the formation was that it managed to fuse their strengths into a single strike. Zavnik would have to be literally 10,000 times more powerful than a normal seventh-dimensional existence to have come out unscathed. In truth, the fact he survived at all was a great surprise to Lionel at the time. Now, he remembered that memory very clearly and he was hesitating about taking even a single step forward. The shadow woman grit her teeth. She was a demon, she was very used to manipulating people. It was one of her favorite pastimes. Often, just to relieve her boredom, she would do such things to Zavnik, but she had never succeeded before. Seeing Zavnik in such a state, and being aware of the tactics of other demons, she knew that Lionel was doing this on purpose. She could almost see the horns growing from his head, that devilish glint in his eyes. He was taking pleasure in it. Her heart couldn't help but shudder as the image of a certain demon race flashed in her mind, but she shook her head immediately. Those demons loved to do this sort of thing. They were exceptionally powerful in body and could defeat most with a flick of their hand, but they preferred to use their minds instead, taking people down long, winding paths until they lost their minds entirely. Even if it would take years to accomplish what a fist could in a second, they would still prefer to take the longer route. They found pride and accomplishment in it. But she couldn't accept such a thing, she most definitely couldn't, because it was impossible for Lionel to be among such a reclusive and small clan of demons. And yet, even so, she found herself hesitating to attack as well. At that moment, though, her gaze turned sharp. She knew the reason why her mind had wavered. It wasn't because of Lionel but rather because that clan of demons left a shadow in everyone's heart. So long as you had heard of them, you couldn't escape. Even when you thought of them, they would be aware of it. The shadow woman was about to attack when Lionel suddenly looked at her and smiled. "I think you should take a look at." She shuddered from head to toe, her body freezing for a moment before she released a violent screech. "Die!" She rushed forward. Rather than backing down, her demon blood seemed to have been provoked and her power soared. Even as many were entranced by the physiques of her body moving with such little clothing, they were even more shocked by the strength. When she had said that she was more powerful than Amory, no one had taken her seriously. She was an unknown existence and Amory was the sword deity. How could they possibly be compared? But at this moment, they swallowed their words. This woman. Less than 100 years old and yet already in Tier 4 of the 7th dimension. Her power surged wildly and her hand formed a clawing motion toward Lionel's head. Her body became incorporeal, becoming a lengthy stretch of shadowy dark force that encompassed the world. There simply didn't seem to be a place to dodge. Her claw expanded to over 10 meters from palm to curled finger, ripping through the kernels of space in her path as she sought for Lionel's death. And yet... bang! The shadow woman felt as though she had been hit by an immovable object and an unstoppable force all at once. She was sent flying back with even greater speed than she had come with, the solidified claw of darkness she had become dispersing like misty drops of water in a howling storm of wind. Zavnik's lip trembled as he slowly looked toward Aina. She simply lowered her palm without much expression on her face, unmoved. Aina's aura was finally clear and nothing short of shocking. She had entered the 7th dimension. Chapter 2102. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 11 seconds p.m. Chapter 2102. Aghast if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The human domain had fallen into silence for a long while. Ever since Amory and Lionel's battle had begun, probably around 70% of all observers had been entirely focused on them. In truth, that number actually seemed quite low, but it was actually surprising that it wasn't even lower than that. That was because to many, the battle was a joke. The idea of a 6th-dimensional existence defeating the sword deity was asinine. The viewership was only that high due to how excellent Lionel's performance had been until now. Those who had come to watch had felt that maybe Lionel had a trump card that he would be ready to spring, one that would catch them off guard like all those other times. However, the longer the battle went on, the more shocked they became. They hadn't actually expected that Lionel would be able to fight Amory head-on at all. And yet they were proven wrong time and time again, until the moment that Amory broke through and entered the Cosmos realm. Many had believed the battle to be over, but even so, they would continue to watch if for nothing other than the fact they felt Lionel deserved at least this much for coming so far despite only being in the 6th dimension. Or rather, they would have, had something else shocking not happened. Aina, yet another 6th-dimensional existence and a newly crowned Queen Beauty, had actually gone off to challenge the number 1 Queen Beauty, the heiress of the spiritual's religion, Soraya. This shocking change left the human domain speechless. Two sixth-dimensional existences, both challenging the greatest geniuses of their respective genders and within their generations. Wasn't this a bit too ridiculous? But then the battle began, and they were shocked once again. The 70-30th split that had become over 99% in Lionel's favor once he showed that he could actually keep up with Amory suddenly became 50-50, with many even jumping back and forth between the two battles. The strength that Soraya displayed was beyond their imagination, placing her firmly on the same level as Amory, at least in the beginning. But then she unleashed a lineage factor that simply took their breaths away. At that moment, the gap between the human race and the spiritual's race was on full display. For such a thing to be an ability that was simply and casually passed down through blood wasn't something that the humans could fathom. It made the most powerful lineage factors of the human domain seem like nothing more than child's play. It was then that they came to understand that Soraya wasn't on Amory's level, she was actually a step or two beyond. But then the situation changed again when Amory broke into the cosmos realm, and they were suddenly on equal footing once more. And unfortunately, unlike Lionel, Aina didn't have a technique that allowed her to touch upon the fourth layer in such a short period of time. Aina unleashed a demonic form that took their breaths away, but it still wasn't nearly enough. She was easily suppressed and beaten and battered, until she suddenly broke through. None present had ever seen a breakthrough into the seventh dimension be so easy nor so smooth. Her power skyrocketed in an instant. Many thought at that moment that they might get to witness an even battle, a nice exchange of movements, but no. It had become a one-sided slaughter. Soraya, despite being in Tier 3 of the 7th dimension, couldn't survive even a single strike from the Tier 1 Aina. She had been completely crushed. There was no suspense at all. In the recent days, because of Lionel and Aina, many had begun thinking that the gap between the 6th and 7th dimensions wasn't so large after all. If they put in more effort and took their training more seriously, they could maybe be like Lionel and Aina. But Aina's breakthrough crushed all those hopes. The gap between the two realms was a wide and inescapable chasm. If it wasn't, how could Aina have improved so much after taking just a single step forward? And now, the cruel reality was that in these air wars, there simply wasn't anyone who was her match any longer. I think you should take a look at Rho Alpha and D Alpha S and Omicron V Epsilon L. See Omicron M above the air wars planet, an illusory woman stood. She was absolutely expressionless, and many who didn't know her would think that she was unreadable because of this. But everyone who had seen her before would understand that she was absolutely infuriated at the moment. This woman was none other than Soraya, the heiress of the spiritual religion. Her body had been destroyed, but as a half-spiritual, she was able to exist with her soul alone. To spirituals, their bodies were only flesh puppets that could be reconstructed with some effort and resources. It was extremely difficult to truly kill them, and they were practically immortal. But, even so, in their race, having one's body destroyed would both regress their strength and be a great humiliation. She had been in the human domain since her birth, but no one had ever dared to disrespect her in such a way. Wherever she went, she always had a lovable smile on her face that no one could ever bring themselves to hate, and that was part of the reason why it was so shocking that her expression was so placid currently. But in her mind, she had every right to be infuriated. She continued to look at Aina, almost as though she was trying to sear this memory onto her soul. Lionel smiled and hadn't moved a single inch from his sitting spot. He had already felt that these air wars were over, but now that Aina had broken through, he didn't even really need to put much effort in any longer. So why couldn't he be leisurely? Why are you glaring at me so fiercely? Lionel asked, putting a hand on his chest. I scare easily, you know, and my wife is very good to me. Those last words about his wife were very clearly a threat that made Zavnik shudder. Aina rolled her eyes, but she couldn't help but be amused. She thought of how she'd definitely be able to teach Lionel a lesson later and felt much better. Zavnik stayed silent for a long time before he suddenly grit his teeth. You actually want to rely on a woman to win the air wars? Don't you feel ashamed? Ugh! Lionel spoke, seemingly aghast at the accusation. Don't be mad at me just because I'm better in bed than you are. Lionel sent a meaningful glance toward the shadow woman who was spitting up a mouthful of blood one after another, struggling to stand. Aina choked on air. Zavnik's mind snapped, suddenly seeing red. He had never been humiliated like this in his life. However, not every such mutation would turn out to be extraordinary. Rho alpha N D alpha S nu omicron V epsilon L omicron M. Zavnik was lucky in that the Morales bloodline had strong ties with demons to begin with. As such, the other half of his lineage worked even better than usual. But what was happening right now was an unexpected variable. It was none other than something that Lionel was quite intimately familiar with: bloodline deviation. When Lionel had first awakened his metal synergy lineage factor, he hadn't been well informed on how things worked. As a result, he had tried to awaken it far too early and before he had developed all 9, or rather, 10 of his nodes. Back then, he had almost failed and the bloodline deviation caused a crimson character to appear within his lineage factor. Even until this moment, he wasn't quite sure what it was, and it was still with him to this day. I think you should take a look at. He didn't really think about it much because it didn't seem to affect him much. However, when he had the conversation with Adaworth's father, he began to speculate that crimson energy was likely related to the Morales family's fiery tempers. It was probably the case that Lionel's bloodline deviation had caused it to appear much earlier in his life than it did for most others. However, there was something else that had happened that day as the elders of the Morales family observed Lionel's breakthrough. The violet winds rise north. Those words were meaningless to Lionel. After all, he hadn't been there when they were spoken and he wasn't even aware of them. But they were currently a shadowy whisper, almost as though an echo of another reality was speaking into his ears. This aside, it was Zavnik's changes that had triggered this memory within Lionel. He seemed to have lost himself to rage, the hidden danger of the Morales family's lineage factor fusing with the intricacies of his demon bloodline. His body was filled with an endless amount of vitality, his divine armor even quickly repairing, but his mind wasn't clear. Large plumes of black fog came from his body, pushing his body up from the ground and standing him up. He looked as though he had been possessed by an abyss of blackness. The shadow woman grit her teeth and suddenly vanished, entering Zavnik's shadow. Her aura vanished entirely and Zavnik's own multiplied several times over. Some clarity returned to his eyes, but a fiendish, menacing hint of something extra was still hidden within. He howled to the skies, a spear twice the height of his body appearing in his hand as he suddenly struck out. Aina stood in silence. From start to end, she didn't seem to feel the need to act at all. Suddenly, a towering crimson manifestation appeared to her back. She struck out a palm the moment it formed, the manifestation and her real body moving as one. Bang! The newly strengthened Zavnik froze, a powerful pressure descending upon him from above. Chapter 2105. Published at 30th of August 2023 12:32 and 5 seconds p.m. Chapter 2105. Shameless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The distance between the territory of the Suyard family and that of the Omens wasn't small. It was easily thousands of kilometers. In addition to this, Lionel hadn't expected to need to take action himself as he felt that the measures he had handed to James and the others were more than enough. While he was fighting against Amory, he had sent Zavnik's army to attack the spiritual's religion. Due to this, Soraya had believed that she was being attacked by a joint force of Lionel, Zavnik, and the pious family on top of that. Due to this, she didn't even have the presence of mind to consider the fact that Amory might also be in trouble. On top of that, because Amory saw that Lionel was the only threat before him, he hadn't cared to report this matter to Soraya either. Like this, the two supposed allies were separated like this. Because Zavnik never showed up personally, Soraya kept waiting for the other foot to drop, not knowing that the black-green armored army was nothing more than a FAA section Ade to keep her pinned down. While all of this was happening, Lionel had sent the others to deal with the Omen family. In his opinion, the Skies family and Oryx with the help of the Cloud race was an undefeatable force. It had to be remembered just how powerful Maya was. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that she was the most powerful existence in these air wars. Maybe only if Lionel broke through to the 7th dimension and then teamed up with Aina could they defeat Maya with any sort of confidence. This wasn't because Maya was so talented, but rather because she had used the special ability of the Cloud race, exchanging her stored up years for immediate strength and power. As a result, while she had only experienced about 20 or so years of life, she had the strength of an absolute genius of the Cloud race that had practiced hard for decades longer than that. If Lionel had been willing to put her out in front, he might have won this war on day one before anyone could do a thing to stop him. The reason he hadn't was that, as he had said, this wasn't his end goal. As he saw it, the air wars were only the beginning, and its purpose wasn't just for him to win either. The air wars was the stage for him to show off his abilities, for the human domain to become aware of who Lionel Morales was and the kind of strength he held. That way, when he conquered them in the future, they would have a deep-seated respect for him in their hearts already. He couldn't do that if he just let Maya run amok from the very beginning. In addition to this, Maya was a trump card he didn't want to reveal too soon. He wouldn't have even traded for her in the first place and brought her into the air wars if it wasn't for the sake of wanting to make sure the Cloud race stayed in line and followed his orders. The talent of the Cloud race when it came to controlling the mind and related matters was too high. Lionel wanted a foolproof plan to control them, so placing seeds into their minds wasn't enough. He thus took control of Maya's sons and then used Maya's prestige to keep the others in line. This was all to say that with Maya present, it should have been impossible for the Omen family to turn the tides. According to Lionel's orders, Maya should have only acted if it was strictly necessary. But, should things go left, he gave her permission to display her true strength. This was why he had been so confident. But what he hadn't expected was for the Omen family to be so shameless, though he should have. Rather than calling these the air wars, it was more like a battle between Lionel and the most powerful families of the human domain. It was absolutely ridiculous. The air wars were meant to test the connections of the younger generation and their abilities. It wasn't a place for powerful families to flaunt their resources. Everyone already knew that they were powerful, but they didn't seem to care about this. Lionel had caught a glimpse of this shamelessness with the Leo family. He knew for a fact that Conan and Gunter hadn't raised those beasts themselves, but they still brought them forward as though they had. And now, the Omen family had placed their full effort behind Crone Omen, the supposed best force crafter of the younger generation. This time, it wasn't just a small horde of beasts at the end of their lives. The Omen family had provided the heirs of the Omen family with all the resources they needed to build a Tier 2 star ship. It had to be remembered that when Lionel stole a Tier 2 star ship from Shield Cross Stars, Cross Elder Avon had been enraged to the point of throwing a tantrum. That kind of wealth was astronomical. It was enough for even an organization of that size to feel the pinch. They even sent an 8th dimensional ancestor after Lionel to try and get it back. Lionel had used a Tier 2 star ship to destroy not just one but 4 of the great families, each of which had had several experts that could have fought the likes of Maya. The strength of such a vessel shouldn't have appeared in the air wars, and the rules had made it so as well. Everyone knew that Lionel had stolen a Tier 2 star ship from Shield Cross Stars, so there was a limit on the kind of vessels and war weapons that could be traded for. If Lionel could just hand over 10,000 points and activate his flagship, the war would have been over. The Morales had agreed to these stipulations. In years past, they hadn't needed such a rule because no one in the younger generation had the resources to build such a vessel, but they felt that it was a good rule to add as well since it would no longer be just the Morales participating now. But obviously, the Omen family had taken advantage of a loophole themselves. See Omicron M. That was because from the very moment Lionel had stepped foot into these air wars, he didn't plan on anything weaker than first place. And the moment Aina had shed blood, Krone's life was already forfeit.